Hello there and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore one of the oldest and most quietly devastating tricks in the history of human civilization, the secret art of debasing currency. We'll discover how kings and emperors learned they could steal from their subjects without anyone noticing, how they could fund wars and palaces by slowly, almost invisibly, reducing the value of the money in everyone's pockets. We'll walk through ancient mints and medieval workshops, through revolutionary printing presses and modern central banks, watching as the same story repeats across thousands of years with different characters but identical motives. If you enjoy these calm explorations of financial history's most profound patterns, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth, and let's begin our slow drift through the centuries, through the quiet crime of currency debasement, toward understanding. There's nowhere you need to be, no deadlines to meet. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin 26 centuries ago, in a place that discovered something that would change human civilization forever. The kingdom of Lydia occupied what is now Western Turkey, a fertile land between the Aegean Sea and the interior plateau of Anatolia. In the 7th century before the Common Era, the Lydians were prosperous traders, sitting at the crossroads of East and West, facilitating commerce between Greek cities on the coast and the great civilizations of Persia and Mesopotamia to the east. They dealt in goods of every kind: olive oil and wine, textiles and grain, precious metals and worked bronze. Trade made them wealthy, but trade also created a problem that had vexed human society since the beginning of commerce itself. How do you exchange value when both parties don't want what the other has to offer? If you're a farmer with wheat and you want olive oil, you need to find someone who both has olive oil and wants wheat. If you can't find that person, you need to engage in a chain of exchanges, trading your wheat for something else that the oil merchant wants. This is inefficient and time-consuming. Societies had partially solved this problem with various forms of commodity money, things that almost everyone would accept in trade because they were useful or beautiful. Cattle, grain, salt, cowrie shells, precious metals, these served as mediums of exchange in different places and times. But precious metals presented their own challenges. A lump of gold or silver had value, certainly, but how much value? How could you be sure it was pure gold and not mixed with cheaper metals? How could you conduct small transactions when the minimum unit of gold was worth more than most everyday purchases? Every transaction required weighing, testing for purity, and calculating relative values. Trust was scarce. Trade was slow. The Lydians solved this problem with an innovation so simple and yet so profound that it's difficult to appreciate from our modern perspective. They created coins, not just lumps of precious metal, but standardized pieces of metal with their weight and purity guaranteed by the stamp of the king. The earliest Lydian coins, dating to around 630 BCE, were small beans of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver found in local rivers. Each coin was stamped with the royal seal, certifying its weight and value. Think about what this meant. A merchant no longer needed to weigh and test metal with every transaction. The king's stamp said this coin is worth this much, and you could trust it because the king's authority guaranteed it. Coins could be made in various denominations, allowing for transactions large and small. They were portable, durable, divisible, and most importantly, they were trustworthy. The invention of coinage was as revolutionary in its time as the internet would be in ours. The most famous Lydian king was Croesus, who ruled from approximately 560 to 546 BCE. His name became synonymous with wealth. Rich as Croesus, people still say, though few remember who he was. Croesus refined the Lydian coinage system, creating separate gold and silver coins of high purity and standardized weight. His staters, the standard gold coin, were trusted throughout the Mediterranean world. Trade flourished. Lydia grew wealthy beyond imagination. The coinage system spread to Greek city-states, to Persia, eventually throughout the ancient world. But here's where our story really begins, because the same innovation that made trade easier also created a profound temptation. Consider the king's position. He controls the mints. He stamps the coins. Everyone trusts that his stamp certifies the coin's weight and purity. But what if he lies? What if he stamps a coin that contains less gold than it's supposed to contain? What if he mixes in cheaper silver or copper, maintaining the coin's weight but reducing its precious metal content? Who would notice immediately? Who could tell without melting down and testing every coin? This is the essential crime we'll be exploring together. This quiet, almost invisible theft that rulers throughout history have perpetrated on their subjects. Currency debasement, the reduction of precious metal content in coins while maintaining their nominal, their stated face value. It's a form of theft so subtle that the victims often don't even notice it's happening until years later, when they realise their savings buy less than they used to, when merchants start demanding more coins for the same goods, when the economic foundation of society slowly crumbles. We don't have clear evidence that Croesus himself debased his coinage. His coins seem to have been honestly minted, which was part of why they were so trusted. But his successors and rulers throughout the ancient world soon discovered this temptation. They discovered they could pay their debts with coins that weren't quite as valuable as everyone thought. They could fund armies and monuments and luxury without raising obvious taxes that might provoke rebellion. They could steal slowly, quietly, over time, in a way that felt almost victimless even as it devastated entire economies. The Greeks had a word for this, paracope, meaning adulteration of currency. They understood early that debasing coinage was theft, a violation of the social contract between ruler and ruled. But understanding something is wrong doesn't prevent people from doing it, especially when the temptation is so enormous and the consequences so delayed. Throughout ancient Greece, in dozens of city-states, coins were issued, trusted, and then gradually debased as rulers found themselves needing more money than they had. Think about the psychology of this for a moment. Imagine you're an ancient king. You've inherited debts. You need to pay soldiers. A foreign enemy threatens, or perhaps you want to build a magnificent temple to impress visitors and secure your legacy. You could raise taxes, but your subjects already grumble about the tax burden, and increasing it might provoke unrest. You could borrow, but from whom and at what interest? Or you could simply order your mint to mix a little more copper into the gold, to make each coin slightly less pure. You still stamp them with the royal seal. You still declare they have the same value. Everyone accepts them as before, at least initially. You've created value from nothing, or so it seems. This is the eternal temptation. Free money, a victimless crime. Of course it isn't victimless and it isn't free, but the victims are diffuse. Everyone who holds money loses a little, and the costs are delayed. By the time people notice that prices are rising, that their savings buy less, the king has already spent his debased coins and the inflation is someone else's problem. Perhaps even his successor's problem, not his own. The Persians who conquered Lydia in 546 BCE continued the coinage system. The Persian daric, a gold coin named after King Darius, circulated widely and was generally kept honest because the Persian Empire understood that trusted currency facilitated trade, and trade enriched the empire. But even the Persians occasionally succumbed to temptation, especially during expensive military campaigns. In Greek city-states, debasement was more common. Athens, powerful and wealthy during its golden age in the 5th century BCE, maintained high-quality silver coinage that was accepted throughout the Mediterranean. Athenian owls, the coins were stamped with the image of an owl, symbol of the goddess Athena, were as good as gold, or rather, as good as the silver they actually contained. But after the Peloponnesian War drained Athenian resources, even Athens debased its coinage, plating copper cores with silver to create coins that looked valuable but weren't. People noticed. Merchants began testing coins, biting them or rubbing them on touchstones to verify their metal content. The market created a discount for suspect coins. Athenian owls from after the war were worth less than owls from before, even though both claimed the same nominal value. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. Athens never fully recovered its economic dominance, and the debasement of its currency was both symptom and cause of its decline. Let that settle for a moment. This pattern we'll see again and again across the centuries: initial honesty creating trust and prosperity, then financial pressure creating temptation, then debasement destroying trust and causing decline. It's a cycle as old as money itself. And we're just beginning our journey through its many repetitions. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, understood that money served three functions. It was a medium of exchange, allowing trade without the inefficiency of barter. It was a unit of account providing a common measure of value, and it was a store of value allowing people to save today's labour for tomorrow's needs. Debasement corrupted all three functions. If merchants couldn't trust coins, they demanded to test them, slowing exchange. If money's value kept changing, it couldn't measure value consistently. And if coins bought less over time, they couldn't store value reliably. Aristotle also understood that money was, in essence, a social agreement. A lump of gold has intrinsic value. You can make jewellery from it. It's beautiful and rare. But a coin's value exceeds its metal content because of what it represents. The king's promise, society's agreement to accept it in trade. Debasement violated that promise, that agreement. It was fundamentally dishonest, a betrayal of trust. Yet Aristotle also observed that rulers kept doing it anyway, because the immediate benefits to the ruler outweighed, in their calculations, the long-term costs to society. This is the tragedy we'll be exploring. Not the grand tragedy of wars and conquests, but the quiet tragedy of trust systematically betrayed, of society slowly poisoned by their rulers' dishonesty, of economic foundations eroded coin by coin, debasement by debasement, across centuries and continents. The story isn't dramatic in the way of battles and revolutions. It's slow, cumulative, almost invisible to those living through it. But its consequences shape the rise and fall of civilizations. As we move forward from ancient Greece, we'll travel to Rome, where the gradual debasement of the denarius mirrored and perhaps contributed to the gradual decline of the empire itself. But we'll approach that story slowly, carefully, letting the details accumulate naturally. There's no rush. We have thousands of years to explore, and we'll take our time with each. Let your breathing slow. Let the ancient world settle into your consciousness like dust motes drifting in afternoon light. If you drift away into sleep, that's perfectly fine. The ancients and their coins will still be here, waiting patiently in history whenever you return. The Roman Empire at its height was a civilization of staggering scope and sophistication. At its peak, it controlled territory from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. Over 50 million people lived under Roman rule, speaking different languages, following different customs, but united by Roman law, Roman roads, and crucially, Roman money. The denarius was the backbone of this economic unity. It was a small silver coin, about the size of a modern dime, introduced in 211 BCE during the Second Punic War. Initially, each denarius contained about 4.5 grams of nearly pure silver, 95 to 98% pure. It was divided into smaller bronze and copper coins for everyday transactions, but the denarius was the standard, the coin that soldiers received as pay, that taxes were calculated in, that merchants used for substantial purchases. Think about holding one of these early denarii in your hand. It would feel solid, substantial, cool and smooth. The silver would shine in the light. On one side, typically, the head of the goddess Roma wearing a winged helmet. On the other, the divine twins Castor and Pollux on horseback. The imagery proclaimed Roman power and divine favour. But more important than the imagery was what the coin represented. Honest weight, honest silver content, the promise of Rome that this coin was worth what it claimed to be worth. For nearly 2 centuries that promise held. The denarius remained stable in weight and purity. This stability was crucial to Rome's success. Soldiers could trust their pay would buy what they needed. Merchants could conduct long-distance trade confident that the coins they received would be accepted elsewhere at full value. Tax collectors could assess levies in denarii knowing the currency wouldn't fluctuate wildly in value. The denarius became one of history's most successful currencies, circulating far beyond Rome's borders, found in archaeological sites from India to Ireland. But maintaining honest currency required discipline. It required resisting temptation. And in the year 64 of the Common Era, the Emperor Nero faced temptations that proved too strong to resist. Nero is remembered for many things, for possibly burning Rome and blaming Christians, for persecuting early Christianity, for artistic pretensions and alleged tyranny. But in the long sweep of economic history, his most consequential act might have been what he did to the denarius. In 64 CE, Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius from approximately 98% to 93.5%. He also reduced the coin's weight slightly. These changes might seem minor, 5 percentage points, a fraction of a gram, but they represented the breaking of a promise that had held for 275 years. Why did Nero do this? He needed money. Rome had burned. Whether he set the fire or not is still debated, but regardless, the city needed rebuilding. Nero had expensive tastes, building a vast palace complex called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, covering hundreds of acres with lavish decorations. Military campaigns continued on the frontiers. The Roman government had expenses, and while it collected taxes, those taxes weren't enough to fund Nero's ambitions and the empire's needs. Nero could have raised taxes, but that would have been unpopular and obvious. Instead, he did something quieter. He debased the currency. When the government paid soldiers or purchased supplies, it paid in these new, slightly less valuable denarii. But it collected taxes and received payments as though the denarii were still worth their old value. The difference was pure profit for the government, what economists call seigniorage, the profit from issuing currency. In the short term, this worked perfectly. The government got more purchasing power from the same amount of silver. People accepted the new coins at face value, either not noticing the difference or not being in a position to refuse them. Nero funded his palace and his projects. Problem solved, or so it seemed. But once the precedent was set, once the promise was broken, it became easier to break it again. And each subsequent emperor who faced financial pressure, which is to say, nearly every emperor, found the temptation irresistible. Why struggle with unpopular tax increases or spending cuts when you could simply reduce the silver content of coins a bit more? Let's walk slowly through what happened over the next 2.5 centuries. Watch the numbers, but more importantly, watch what they meant for real people living real lives in the Roman world. Under Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, the denarius remained relatively stable, still containing about 90 to 93% silver. Trajan was a successful military emperor, expanding the empire to its greatest extent. And his conquests brought in enough wealth, particularly from the gold mines of Dacia, modern Romania, that he didn't need to debase significantly. The empire could afford honesty. But under Trajan's successors, the slow erosion continued. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius from 161 to 180 CE, the denarius contained only about 75 to 80% silver. Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher-emperor, famous for his meditations, but even philosophy couldn't solve the empire's chronic budget problems. Wars on multiple frontiers drained resources. A devastating plague, possibly smallpox, killed millions and reduced the tax base. Debasement seemed like the only option. The really dramatic debasement came in the 3rd century, particularly under the Severan dynasty. Septimius Severus, who ruled from 193 to 211, reduced the denarius to about 50% silver. He famously advised his sons to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else, advice that reflected his priorities and the empire's increasing militarization. Keeping the army loyal required paying them well, and debasement allowed the government to pay soldiers in coins that seemed valuable but cost less to produce. Caracalla, Severus's son, went further. In 215 he introduced a new coin called the Antoninianus, supposedly worth 2 denarii but containing only 1.5 denarii worth of silver. It was debasement masquerading as monetary reform. For a while, people accepted the fiction that 2 coins worth 1.5 denarii equaled 2 denarii worth 2 denarii. But markets aren't fooled forever. By the middle of the 3rd century, during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman monetary system was collapsing. Between 235 and 284, Rome had more than 50 emperors, most ruling only briefly before being assassinated or defeated in civil war. Each needed money to pay troops, and each debased further. The Antoninianus, which had started at 50% silver, fell to 20%, then 5%, then essentially became a copper coin with a thin silver wash. Imagine you're a Roman living through this period. Perhaps you're a merchant in the city of Rome, or a farmer in Gaul, or a soldier on the Danube frontier. You receive coins as payment, wages, or payment for goods sold, or perhaps an inheritance from a deceased relative. These coins look like money. They're stamped with the emperor's image. They're officially currency of the Roman state, but year by year you notice they buy less. The bread you used to purchase for 1 coin now costs 2 coins, then 3. Landlords raise rents, craftsmen raise prices. Everyone knows the coins are worth less, but what can you do? You can't refuse to accept them. They're legal tender, and besides, they're the only money there is. You could try to hold goods instead of money, but goods are bulky and perishable. You could try to hold old coins with higher silver content, but those disappear from circulation quickly. This disappearance of good coins is what economists much later would call Gresham's law: bad money drives out good money. If you have both old denarii with high silver content and new denarii with low silver content, and both are legally worth the same amount, which do you spend and which do you save? Obviously you spend the bad coins and save the good ones, or better yet, melt down the good ones for their silver content. Everyone does this. The result is that only the debased coins circulate, while the honest coins disappear, hoarded or melted. The Roman government tried various responses to the monetary crisis, none very successful. Price controls were attempted multiple times. The most famous was the Edict on Maximum Prices issued by the Emperor Diocletian in 301. Diocletian tried to stabilize the economy by simply declaring what the maximum price of various goods and services could be. The edict was remarkably detailed. It specified maximum prices for over 1,000 items, from wheat to silk, from haircuts to wages for teachers. But price controls don't work when the underlying problem is currency debasement. If coins are worth less, prices must rise to reflect that reality. Declaring that prices can't rise doesn't change the underlying monetary problem. What happened instead was predictable. Merchants who couldn't sell at a profit simply stopped selling. Goods disappeared from markets. Black markets emerged where real prices, higher than legal prices, prevailed. The edict was a failure, largely abandoned within a few years. Diocletian did attempt real monetary reform. He introduced new coins of better quality, trying to restore trust in the currency, but by this point, the damage was deep. Generations had lived through debasement. Trust was gone. People doubted any government money. The economy increasingly operated on barter or on payment in kind rather than in coin. Taxes, which had been collected in denarii, were increasingly collected as grain, oil, wine, conscripted labour, anything but the worthless coins. Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337, introduced a new gold coin called the solidus. This was a genuinely valuable coin, containing about 4.5 grams of pure gold, and Constantine kept it honest. The solidus would remain the standard gold coin for centuries, even surviving the fall of the Western Roman Empire and continuing in the Byzantine East. But the existence of an honest gold coin for large transactions didn't help ordinary people who needed everyday money for ordinary purchases. Silver and copper coins, the currencies of daily life, remained debased and suspect. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed, traditionally dated to 476 when the last emperor was deposed, though the reality was a longer, more gradual process. The monetary system had long since ceased functioning. The empire that had once united the Mediterranean world with a common, trusted currency ended in monetary chaos, with trade reduced to barter and regions economically isolated from each other. The connection between monetary debasement and imperial decline is complex. The empire didn't fall just because of bad money. Barbarian invasions, political instability, administrative inefficiency, plague, climate change, all these factors played roles. But debasement both reflected and contributed to the larger dysfunction. It reflected the government's inability to raise revenue honestly through taxation, and its need to resort to what was essentially counterfeiting its own currency. And it contributed to economic decline by destroying the trust necessary for a sophisticated monetary economy to function. Think about what was lost. The Roman Empire at its height had economic integration that wouldn't be matched again in Europe for over 1,000 years. Goods and people moved across vast distances. Specialization and trade created wealth. Cities flourished. All of this rested on trust. Trust in law, trust in roads and communication, and fundamentally trust in money. When money couldn't be trusted, the whole edifice became shakier. The gradual nature of Roman debasement is important to understand. This wasn't a sudden crisis. It was a slow poison, accumulating over generations. Someone born in the reign of Marcus Aurelius might have lived to see Diocletian's reign, experiencing 70 years of intermittent but cumulative debasement. In their childhood, coins were mostly silver. In their old age, coins were mostly copper. The change was dramatic over a lifetime, but gradual enough year to year that there was never a single moment of obvious crisis, never a clear point where you could say, now the currency has failed. This gradualism is characteristic of currency debasement. It's why rulers choose it. If you raise taxes by 50% in a single year, there would be riots. But if you reduce the silver content of coins by 2% per year for 25 years, achieving the same 50% reduction, people notice it less. They see prices rising slowly and they grumble. But they don't clearly identify the government's monetary policy as the cause. They might blame greedy merchants or bad harvests or foreign wars. The ruler escapes direct blame. Later, Romans understood what had happened. When the historian Cassius Dio wrote about Nero's debasement in the early 3rd century, he noted that Nero's policy had started the empire down a dangerous path. Other writers connected monetary debasement to broader moral and political decline. But understanding the problem didn't mean they could solve it, especially when each emperor faced the same pressures and temptations that had driven his predecessors to debase. What lessons did later ages draw from Rome's monetary experience? That's complicated, because for much of the Middle Ages the details of Roman monetary policy were poorly understood. Medieval rulers knew that Rome had fallen, that its currency had become worthless. They didn't always know the specific mechanisms or timeline, but they reinvented the same solutions and made the same mistakes, as we'll see as we continue our journey. For now, let the Roman experience settle in your mind. Picture the slow decline. Each coin slightly less silver, each year prices slightly higher, each generation slightly less prosperous than the last. Picture the merchants testing coins, the hoarders saving old currency, the government trying to force acceptance of debased money while knowing it was dishonest. Picture an empire that had lasted centuries, that had seemed eternal, slowly hollowing out from within, its economic foundation corroded by its own rulers' short-term thinking. The Roman denarius, which had started as a promise of honest value, ended as a broken promise, a symbol of decline. The same metal that had united an empire in its rise couldn't save it in its fall, because the metal was gone, replaced by cheaper substitutes, and with it went the trust that makes civilization possible. Let that image rest as we prepare to move forward to medieval Europe, where new kingdoms would face the same ancient temptations and largely succumb to them in the same ancient ways. But that's a story for another act. For now, breathe slowly. Let your mind wander among the ruins of Rome, among the coins scattered across centuries, and rest in the knowledge that we've begun to understand a pattern that will repeat again and again across the long history of human money. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed, but money didn't disappear. People still needed to exchange goods, to save value, to conduct commerce. What emerged from the ruins of Rome was a patchwork of successor kingdoms, Frankish, Gothic, Lombard, Anglo-Saxon, each creating its own coinage, each rediscovering both the utility of standardized currency and the temptation to debase it. Medieval Europe was a very different economic world from Imperial Rome. Trade was more local, less sophisticated. Many transactions occurred through barter or payment in kind. The money economy shrank dramatically in the 6th and 7th centuries, but it never entirely disappeared, and from the 8th century onward it began to revive. With that revival came the need for coins, and with coins came the familiar problems. Let's step into medieval England. Because England's monetary history is particularly well documented and illustrates patterns common across medieval Europe. After the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, coinage largely disappeared for several generations. When it returned, in the 7th century it came in the form of small silver pennies. These pennies were thin, irregular discs of silver. Hand-struck by moneyers who placed a blank piece of silver between two dies and hammered them together to create the coin's design. By the time of William the Conqueror in 1066, England had a relatively sophisticated coinage system. The silver penny was the standard coin. It was periodically recalled and recoined. The old pennies would be brought to royal mints, melted down and struck into new pennies. This gave the king an opportunity to profit. He might decree that 3 old pennies would be exchanged for only 2 new pennies, or that a fee would be charged for the recoinage. This was a form of taxation through currency manipulation, but at least it was relatively open, and the new coins were generally of honest weight and silver content. But medieval kings, like Roman emperors before them, constantly needed money. They fought wars against each other, against rebellious nobles, against foreign invaders. They built castles and cathedrals, they maintained courts and paid officials, and their revenues, primarily from feudal dues and customs, were often insufficient. The temptation to debase coinage, to make each pound of silver stretch to produce more coins than it honestly should, was overwhelming. The debasement could take several forms. The most straightforward was simply mixing cheaper metals, copper or tin, with the silver, reducing the silver content while maintaining the coin's stated value. Another method was reducing the weight of coins while keeping their nominal value the same. And then there was the technique that gave this chapter its title, physical clipping. Imagine a medieval silver penny. It's roughly circular, but the edges are irregular because it was hand-struck. The design in the centre is clear, but the edges fade into blank silver. Someone with shears, literally scissors for cutting metal, could carefully clip small amounts of silver from around the edge of the coin. Done carefully, the coin would still look acceptable, would still be recognisable as a penny, but it would weigh less. It would contain less silver. The clippings could be saved, melted down, and sold or made into new coins. This clipping wasn't usually done by kings, at least not officially. It was done by individuals, merchants, money changers, criminals who handled large numbers of coins and could accumulate significant amounts of silver from small clips on many coins. It was illegal, of course, and the penalties could be severe. In England, clippers who were caught could be executed, but the profit was substantial and the risk of being caught was low if you were careful. There was also a related technique called sweating. You'd put coins in a bag and shake them vigorously, or heat them slightly and shake them. Tiny particles of silver would rub off and collect in the bottom of the bag. It was slower than clipping, but even harder to detect. A coin that had been sweated still looked intact, just slightly lighter. The problem with widespread clipping and sweating was that it degraded the entire currency. As more and more clipped coins entered circulation, people became suspicious of all coins. They'd weigh them, testing whether they were full weight. They'd refuse underweight coins or accept them only at a discount. This created confusion and slowed commerce. It also presented kings with a problem. Their own revenues came in as coins, and if those coins were clipped, the king was being cheated just like everyone else. The solution periodically was recoinage. The king would decree that all old coins must be brought in exchange for new coins of full weight and proper silver content. This restored trust in the currency, but it also gave the king an opportunity. Because when he recoined the currency, he could change the ratio, decreeing that 4 old coins would be exchanged for only 3 new ones, for instance. Or he could make the new coins slightly less pure or slightly lighter than they were supposed to be. Recoinage became another tool of debasement just officially sanctioned. One of the most dramatic examples of medieval debasement occurred under King Henry VIII of England. Henry is famous for his 6 wives, for breaking with the Catholic Church, for his larger-than-life personality. But one of his most consequential acts was what came to be called the Great Debasement, which lasted from 1542 to 1551. When Henry became king in 1509, England's silver coinage was of good quality. The penny and larger coins like the shilling and crown that had been introduced in earlier reigns contained high-purity silver. But Henry had expensive tastes and even more expensive policies. He built palaces, Hampton Court, Nonsuch Palace, on a lavish scale. He maintained a magnificent court. He fought wars in France and Scotland, and he dissolved the monasteries, seizing their property, which should have enriched him, but somehow the money was never enough. By the 1540s, Henry's financial situation was desperate. He needed money to continue his wars. Traditional revenues weren't sufficient, and Parliament was reluctant to grant new taxes. So Henry turned to currency debasement on a scale England had never seen. In 1542, Henry began issuing coins with reduced silver content. At first, the reduction was modest, from 92% silver to 75%. But over the next 9 years, the debasement accelerated. By 1546, coins were only 50% silver. By 1549, under Henry's son Edward VI, Henry had died in 1547, but the debasement continued. Coins were only 25% silver, the rest being copper. Think about what this looked like and felt like for people living through it. The new coins coming from the mint were visibly different. They looked reddish because of the high copper content. People called them red shillings. The coins would tarnish quickly, the copper oxidizing to green. When you rubbed them, the thin silver coating would wear away, revealing copper underneath. They were obviously not pure silver, obviously not what coins were supposed to be. But they were legal tender, bearing the king's image and seal, and you were required to accept them at face value. If you refused them, you could be punished. If you accepted them only at a discount reflecting their true metal content, you were violating the law. The government insisted that a shilling was a shilling regardless of what it was made of. That value came from royal decree rather than metal content. This created enormous economic disruption. Merchants raised prices because they knew the coins were worth less. A loaf of bread that had cost 2 pence in 1540 might cost 6 pence by 1550. Wages were supposed to rise correspondingly, but they lagged behind prices, meaning working people's real wages fell. Anyone with savings denominated in silver coins saw those savings evaporate. If you had saved £100 in 1540, by 1550 those same coins might buy only a quarter of what they once had. Foreign trade was particularly disrupted. Foreign merchants knew English coins were debased and refused to accept them at face value. English merchants buying foreign goods had to pay premiums or convert their money at unfavourable rates. English exports became cheaper for foreigners, which sounds good but actually reflected the weakness of English currency. The debasement amounted to a hidden tax that fell particularly hard on the poor and on anyone living on fixed incomes. The government, meanwhile, profited enormously in the short term. When you brought a pound of silver to the mint would return coins that were nominally worth far more than a pound of silver should produce. The difference was pure profit, seigniorage. Henry's government raised somewhere between £1 million and £3 million through the Great Debasement, an enormous sum at the time, though estimates vary because medieval financial records are incomplete. This money funded wars, building projects, government expenses. It allowed Henry to pursue his policies without the political difficulty of raising taxes openly. But the economic and social costs were severe. Contemporary observers wrote about the suffering of common people, about merchants refusing to sell goods because money was unreliable, about the breakdown of trust. Thomas Smith, a scholar who later advised Queen Elizabeth, wrote that the debasement had __2 __ of the Commonwealth, impoverishing the realm even as it enriched the government temporarily. The debasement finally ended when Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558. One of her first major acts was the Great Recoinage of 1560 to 1561. All the debased coins were called in. They were melted down and restruck into new coins of honest silver content. Elizabeth's government absorbed the cost of this, exchanging good coins for bad ones, which was substantial. But it restored trust in English currency and laid the foundation for economic recovery. Elizabeth understood something crucial that her predecessors had ignored or denied. Money functions on trust. If people don't trust the currency, the economy can't function properly. The short-term profits from debasement were far outweighed by the long-term costs of economic disruption, inflation, and loss of confidence. Elizabeth's restoration of honest money was expensive, but it was one of the wisest policies of her long reign. The same patterns played out across medieval Europe. In France, the livre, the pound, the basic unit of account, was repeatedly debased over centuries. French kings faced the same pressures as English kings: wars, expenses, inadequate revenues, and they made the same choice: debase the currency. By the late medieval period, the livre had lost most of its original silver content. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of hundreds of small states, each with their own coinage rights, was even more chaotic. Some states maintained relatively honest coinage, others debased shamelessly. The result was confusion. Hundreds of different coins circulating of varying and uncertain value, with merchants needing to constantly calculate exchange rates and test coins for weight and purity. Venice and Florence. The great Italian trading cities generally maintained better monetary discipline than territorial kingdoms. The Venetian ducat and the Florentine florin were gold coins of high purity and consistent weight, trusted across Europe and the Mediterranean. This monetary honesty was crucial to these cities' commercial success. Merchants preferred to settle accounts in ducats or florins because they knew the value was stable. The Italian cities understood that their prosperity depended on trust, and that debasement would destroy the trust on which their trading networks depended. But even in Italy, debasement occurred in smaller cities and in silver coinage. The temptation was universal. Only where commercial interests were powerful enough to resist royal or princely authority could honest money be maintained consistently. Medieval people weren't naive about debasement. They understood what was happening. Scholars wrote treatises about money and value. Nicolas Resme, a French philosopher and economist of the 14th century, wrote a treatise called Quote 3, in which he argued forcefully that debasement was theft, that rulers had no right to alter the value of money for their own profit, that such alterations harmed the commonwealth. Oresme's arguments were sophisticated and compelling. They were also largely ignored by the rulers who needed money and had the power to debase coins. The common people had their own ways of understanding and responding to debasement. They learned to test coins, to distinguish good from bad. Money changers set up tables in market squares, weighing coins and exchanging clipped or debased coins for better ones at appropriate discounts. This was a necessary service, but it also slowed commerce and introduced friction into every transaction. In a world of honest money, you simply count coins. In a world of debased money, you weigh and test them, and even then you might be cheated. Gresham's law operated in medieval Europe just as it had in ancient Rome. Good coins disappeared from circulation as people hoarded them, or melted them for their silver content. Bad coins proliferated. Monarchs periodically tried to force good coins back into circulation, decreeing that hoarding was illegal, or that old coins must be brought to the mint. But people aren't stupid. If good money and bad money have the same legal value but different real value, everyone chooses to keep the good and spend the bad. The physical techniques of medieval debasement are worth contemplating because they reveal the almost intimate relationship people had with their money. Unlike modern currency, which we barely look at, medieval people examined their coins carefully. They knew what a good coin felt like, how it sounded when dropped on a table, how it looked in light. Merchants carried small scales to weigh coins. They had touchstones, dark stones against which they could rub gold or silver to test purity by the colour of the streak left behind. They had learned wariness through hard experience. Clipping was sometimes done with remarkable skill. A good clipper could remove 10 or 15% of a coin's weight, while leaving it looking acceptable to casual inspection. The clippings would be saved carefully, perhaps filed or ground into powder. When enough was accumulated, it could be sold to goldsmiths or taken to corrupt moneyers who would turn it into new coins, illegally of course. Since only royal mints were supposed to produce coin, the penalties for private clipping were severe because it threatened the king's monopoly on coinage and his ability to profit from debasement himself. In England, clipping was considered treason because coins bore the king's image, and damaging them was an attack on royal authority. Convicted clippers could be hanged or, if they were women, burned at the stake. Yet the practice continued because the profits were substantial and enforcement was difficult. In an age before modern policing, catching clippers required either bad luck on the clipper's part or betrayal by an associate. Royal debasement, by contrast, was perfectly legal, even though it accomplished the same thing, reducing the precious metal content of coins as illegal clipping. The difference was who profited. When individuals clipped coins, they kept the silver. When kings debased coins, the crown kept the profit. Medieval people understood this hypocrisy. They grumbled about it, wrote about it, sometimes rebelled against it. But the king had force on his side. What was criminal for subjects was state policy for the sovereign. the Church added its voice to the debate, though not always consistently. Theologians argued about whether debasement was a sin. Some maintained that it was a form of theft and therefore sinful. Others argued that the king had a legitimate authority over the coinage and could alter it as needed. The debate reflected larger questions about the limits of royal power and the rights of subjects. But theological arguments rarely stopped kings who needed money. Medieval debasement also shows us something about the relationship between technology and economic honesty. Ancient coins were generally quite pure, not just because rulers were more honest, but because metallurgical techniques made it difficult to create convincing alloys. You could mix silver and copper, but the resulting coin looked and felt obviously wrong. Medieval metallurgy improved, allowing more sophisticated alloys that could pass for pure silver to casual inspection. This technological advance made debasement easier and more tempting. Later, improved minting technology would help prevent debasement, as we'll see when we get to Isaac Newton and the recoinage of the 1690s. But in the medieval period, the advantage lay with the debaser. Hand-struck coins had irregular edges that made clipping easy. Inconsistent striking meant coins varied naturally in weight, making it hard to detect when one had been deliberately lightened. The technology of money production lagged behind the ingenuity of those who wanted to debase. Consider the social effects of living in a society where money couldn't be trusted. Every transaction required wariness. Merchants had to price goods with an assumption that some coins they received would be clipped or debased. Wages had to be negotiated not just in terms of number of coins, but in terms of which coins, old or new, full weight or clipped. Long-term contracts became problematic because the value of money changed unpredictably. Lending money was risky because you might be repaid in coins worth less than those you lent. This uncertainty hindered economic development. Complex commercial arrangements require trust that future payments will have predictable value. If money's value changes capriciously, it's harder to make long-term plans, to invest, to build businesses that depend on credit and deferred payment. Some economic historians argue that medieval Europe's relatively slow economic development, compared to its later rapid growth, was partly due to monetary instability caused by repeated debasement. There were attempts at reform beyond Elizabeth's recoinage. Various rulers, recognizing the damage debasement caused, would restore honest coinage. But these reforms rarely lasted because the next war or the next expensive project would create the same pressures and temptations. The cycle repeated. Honest coinage established or restored, gradual debasement as pressures mounted, crisis and recoinage, then the cycle beginning again. France's monetary history is particularly illustrative of this cycle. The livre was originally a pound of silver, hence its name. But through repeated debasements over centuries, it became increasingly disconnected from any physical reality. By the 18th century, the livre was a unit of account, a way of measuring value, but the actual coin circulating bore complicated relationships to this unit. There were livres tournois and livres parisis, different accounting systems, and a bewildering variety of actual coins. The whole system was confusing, inefficient, and unstable, the product of centuries of ad hoc debasements and failed reforms. Medieval debasement teaches us that the problem isn't just economic. It's also political and moral. Economically, debasement causes inflation and disrupts commerce. Politically, it represents a failure of governance, rulers unable or unwilling to raise revenue honestly, choosing instead a form of hidden taxation that falls hardest on those least able to bear it. Morally, it's a betrayal of trust. The ruler promises that this coin is worth this much, but the promise is a lie. People must accept the lie or face punishment, even as the lie impoverishes them. The medieval period also shows us that understanding a problem doesn't mean you can solve it. Medieval people, from philosophers to merchants to common labourers, understood that debasement was harmful. But the incentives for rulers to debase remained powerful, and the institutional constraints that might have prevented debasement were weak. Kings could generally debase coins without needing anyone's permission. Subjects could complain but had little recourse. The problem was structural, not just a matter of individual virtue or vice. As night deepens around you now, as you listen to this slow tale of medieval money and medieval deception, let yourself sink into the strangeness of that world. Imagine living in a time when the coins in your purse might literally be worth less tomorrow than today, when the king could simply decree that your savings were diminished, when every transaction required vigilance against fraud both private and official. It was a world where money was simultaneously more physical, actual metal you could hold and weigh, and less reliable than our modern currency. The medieval experience of debasement would eventually lead to demands for monetary reform, for systems that couldn't be manipulated so easily by rulers. But those reforms were still centuries away as we end our time in medieval Europe. For now, rest in this knowledge. The same story is played out again and again in ancient Rome, in medieval Europe. In every society that has created money and given some people power over that money, the pattern is persistent because the temptation is enormous and the costs are dispersed and delayed. Understanding this pattern is the first step towards seeing how it continues in different forms into our own time, but we'll explore those continuations later. For now, let medieval Europe fade, let the clipped coins and debased shillings scatter into historical darkness, and rest easy knowing that some people, at least, eventually learn to resist these temptations and build more honest monetary systems. How they did so is a story for another time, a story of science and reform, waiting patiently for us to return to it when we're ready. The medieval period gave way slowly to what we call the early modern era, and with it came new thinking about many things: science, government, religion, and eventually money. But before honest money could be established, before the reforms we'll explore in our next part of the story, there had to be one more dramatic demonstration of why those reforms were necessary. That demonstration came in England, in the late 17th century, when the accumulated debasement of centuries reached a crisis point that threatened to destroy the economy entirely. By the 1690s, English silver coinage was in a deplorable state. Most of the coins in circulation were old, dating back decades or even a century. They'd been clipped, sweated, worn smooth by use, and debased through various official and unofficial means. A coin that was supposed to weigh a certain amount and contain a certain amount of silver might actually weigh half that and contain far less silver. The situation was chaotic and getting worse. The physical process of clipping had become almost an industry. Let's understand exactly how it worked, because the mechanics matter. A clipper would collect coins, perhaps as a merchant receiving many coins in trade, or as a money changer, or simply as someone who handled large amounts of money. The clipper would examine each coin, looking for ones that still had enough edge that some could be removed without making the coin obviously defective. Medieval and early modern coins were hand-struck, as we've discussed. A blank piece of silver was placed between two dies, metal stamps with the coin's design carved into them. A worker would place the blank between the dies and strike the top die with a hammer, impressing the design onto both sides of the coin. This process had limitations. The dies were circular and the designs were centered, but the actual blank might not be perfectly centered, or might be slightly irregular in shape. The result was that the design appeared clearly in the center of the coin, but the edges were often just blank silver. A skilled clipper could carefully trim this blank edge with shears, metal cutting scissors. The trick was to remove metal without cutting into the design. If the king's portrait or the coat of arms was intact, the coin might still be accepted in trade even though it was underweight. The clipper would save the clippings, small crescents or slivers of silver, until he had accumulated enough to melt down and sell, or to have made into new coins through corrupt officials. Sweating was subtler. Coins would be placed in a bag with some abrasive substance, sand perhaps, or small metal filings. The bag would be shaken vigorously. As the coins rubbed against each other and against the abrasive tiny particles of silver, would abrade away and collect in the bottom of the bag. A single sweating might remove only a tiny amount from each coin, but multiply that by thousands of coins, and the profit was substantial. And sweated coins were very difficult to detect because they showed no obvious signs of tampering. By the 1690s, it was estimated that the silver coins in circulation had lost somewhere between a third to a half of their original silver content through clipping, sweating, and wear. This created enormous problems. Foreign merchants refused to accept English coins at face value. They'd weigh them and accept them only at the reduced value that corresponded to their actual silver content. This made international trade difficult and expensive for English merchants. Domestically, two different values emerged for coins. There was the official value, what the government said a shilling or a crown was worth. And there was the market value, what the coin's actual silver content was worth if melted down. Good coins, if any could be found, were hoarded or melted for their silver. Only the clipped, worn coins circulated. Trade became complicated and contentious, with every transaction requiring negotiation about which coins were acceptable and at what value. The government's revenues suffered too. Taxes were paid in coins, and those coins were clipped and worn. The government was essentially being paid in degraded currency. When the government tried to spend those coins, paying soldiers, purchasing supplies, recipients might refuse them or accept them only at reduced value. The state itself was being undermined by the decay of its own currency. Something had to be done. The question was what? Various proposals circulated. Some argued for simply accepting the reality, declaring that coins were now worth less, adjusting all values downward to match the actual silver content in circulation. This would have been honest in one sense, acknowledging the facts. But it would also have validated the theft that clippers and sweaters had perpetrated. It would have rewarded those who'd debased the currency and punished those who'd held onto good coins. Others argued for a full recoinage, calling in all the old coins, melting them down, and issuing new coins of full weight and proper silver content. This was expensive. Who would bear the cost? If the government exchanged new good coins for old bad coins at face value, the government would take a huge loss. If it exchanged them at actual metal value, coin holders would take the loss, which would be deeply unpopular and would punish people who'd done nothing wrong. The debate was intense and technical, involving the greatest minds of the age. John Locke, the philosopher, weighed in with essays arguing for maintaining the standard. A pound sterling should contain the same amount of silver it had always contained, and the recoinage should restore that standard. William Lowndes, Secretary to the Treasury, argued for devaluation, acknowledging the new reality and adjusting the standard. The arguments ranged across economics, morality, and political philosophy. Ultimately, the decision was made to restore the old standard. In 1696, the Great Recoinage began. All old silver coins were called in. They were to be exchanged for new coins of full weight and standard silver content. The government absorbed most of the cost, though not without controversy and hardship. The process took several years and was remarkably disruptive to the economy. At various points, there simply weren't enough coins in circulation to conduct normal commerce, forcing people back to barter or to I owe us. But the recoinage succeeded eventually in restoring trust in English currency, and crucially it came with technological improvements that would make future clipping much more difficult. This is where Isaac Newton enters our story, and where medieval monetary practices finally gave way to something more modern and more honest. Newton is famous as a scientist, of course. His Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, laid out the laws of motion and gravity that revolutionized physics. But in 1699, Newton was appointed Warden of the Royal Mint, and in 1700 he became Master of the Mint, positions he would hold until his death in 1727. He took these positions seriously, bringing scientific rigour to the production of money. Newton's most important contribution was the introduction and perfection of milled coinage. Milling meant using machines to strike coins instead of hand-hammering them. More importantly, it meant using machines to create a raised edge or a series of grooves, what we call reeding, around the coin's circumference. This edge made clipping immediately obvious. If you clipped a milled coin with a reeded edge, the reading would be interrupted. Anyone could see at a glance that the coin had been tampered with. The technology for milling coins had existed for some time. It was invented in the 16th century, but it had been slow and expensive, so hand-struck coins continued to predominate. Newton improved the milling machinery and standardized the process, making machine-struck coins with anti-clipping features the norm rather than the exception. Newton also pursued clippers with remarkable zeal. He personally investigated counterfeiting and clipping rings, sometimes going undercover in taverns and gin houses to gather evidence. He interrogated suspects and sent numerous people to trial. Many were convicted and executed. This seems harsh to modern sensibilities, and perhaps it was harsh even then. But Newton understood that the monetary system depended on trust, and that trust required both good coins and the suppression of those who would debase them. Under Newton's tenure, English coinage became reliable and trustworthy. A shilling was genuinely worth a shilling. A crown contained the silver it was supposed to contain. The raised edge prevented clipping. The consistent quality prevented confusion. This monetary honesty laid a foundation for England's economic growth in the 18th century. Trade could proceed smoothly. Credit could expand. Long-term contracts and complex financial arrangements became possible because money's value was predictable. The contrast with earlier periods is stark. Medieval kings had debased coins for short-term profit, damaging the economy in the process. The Great Recoinage and Newton's reforms did the opposite. The government spent money to improve the coinage, and the resulting economic benefits far outweighed the initial costs. Honest money was good policy, not just good morality. Newton's contribution went beyond the technical. He also began to articulate principles that would later be formalized as the gold standard. Newton calculated the relative values of gold and silver and helped establish the ratio at which they should exchange. His calculations were influential in England's eventual move toward a de facto gold standard in the 18th century, though that full development came after his death. The gold standard concept was simple in principle. Currency would be backed by gold. Paper notes or coins would be convertible into a fixed amount of gold. This convertibility would prevent governments from inflating the money supply arbitrarily. You couldn't just print more money or mint more coins because you'd need more gold to back them. The gold standard imposed discipline. Of course, the gold standard had its own problems, which we'll explore later. But in the context of centuries of arbitrary debasement, the idea of tying currency to a physical commodity that couldn't be created at will seemed like a solution to an ancient problem. It represented a commitment to monetary honesty enforced by physical constraints rather than by the self-discipline of rulers, which had proven unreliable. Let's pause here and think about what had been accomplished by the early 1700s in England. The country had moved from debased, clipped, chaotic coinage to honest, standardized, trustworthy money. This didn't happen automatically or easily. It required political will, technical innovation, substantial financial cost, and consistent enforcement against counterfeiters and clippers. But it worked. And it demonstrated that honest money was possible, that the cycle of debasement wasn't inevitable. Other countries watched England's example with interest. Some followed, reforming their own coinages and adopting milled edges and stricter standards. Others continued with debased currencies, to their economic detriment. The divergence in monetary policy contributed to divergence in economic development. Countries with reliable currencies attracted trade and investment. Countries with unreliable currencies suffered capital flight and commercial disadvantage. France, England's great rival, maintained a more chaotic monetary system well into the 18th century. French coinage was complex, with multiple types of coins, frequent revaluations, and less rigorous quality control. This monetary disorder was one of many factors contributing to France's financial problems, which would eventually culminate in revolution. But that's getting ahead of our story. The important point is that by the early 18th century, solutions to the ancient problem of debasement existed. Technology, milled edges, machine striking, made physical clipping obsolete. Institutional arrangements, the mint's independence, legal backing for currency standards, made official debasement more difficult. An intellectual understanding, Locke's philosophy, Newton's science, emerging economic thought, provided justification and rationale for honest money. Yet the problem of debasement didn't disappear, it merely evolved. Because around the same time that Newton was perfecting honest coinage, a new form of money was emerging, paper money. And paper money, as we'll see, created entirely new opportunities and temptations for debasement. You couldn't clip a paper note, but you could print more of them. The technology changed, but the underlying dynamic, the temptation to create more money than the economy's real resources justified, remained exactly the same. Before we move to that next chapter, though, let's sit with the achievement that the Great Recoinage and Newton's reforms represented. For the first time in centuries, perhaps for the first time in history on such a scale, a major economy had established a monetary system that was both sophisticated and honest. Coins could be trusted, trade could flourish, people could save without fear that their savings would be invisibly stolen through debasement. It was a genuine accomplishment, worth celebrating even as we acknowledge its limitations and temporary nature. Think about holding one of Newton's new shillings in your hand. It would feel substantial, properly weighted. The silver would gleam. The edges would have precise reading, regular grooves that served both decorative and practical purposes. The design would be sharp and clear, struck by machine with consistent pressure. This was a coin you could trust. This was money that fulfilled its promise. The ordinary people of England in the early 1700s might not have understood all the technical and economic details, but they understood that something important had changed. The confusion and anxiety of the 1690s, when no one knew what their money was worth, had given way to stability. Merchants could price goods confidently. Workers could trust their wages. The monetary chaos that had plagued Europe for centuries had been, at least in England, at least for a time, resolved. This achievement rested on several foundations. There was the technical foundation, the machinery and methods that made clipping impractical. There was the legal foundation, laws against counterfeiting and clipping, rigorously enforced. There was the institutional foundation, the mint as a professional quasi-independent body, focused on maintaining standards. And there was the intellectual foundation, the growing understanding among educated people that money's value came from trust, and that trust required honesty. All of these elements had to come together. Technology alone wasn't enough. Milled coins had existed before but weren't universally adopted because the will to adopt them was lacking. Laws alone weren't enough. Medieval England had laws against clipping, but enforcement was sporadic. Understanding alone wasn't enough. Scholars had long known debasement was harmful, but kings debased anyway. Only when all these elements aligned did lasting reform become possible. This teaches us something important about solving complex social problems. Technical solutions must be combined with institutional arrangements, legal frameworks, and shared understanding. Change requires not just knowing what to do, but building the systems and consensus to actually do it. The Great Recoinage succeeded not just because Newton designed better coins, but because there was political will to bear the cost, legal machinery to prevent backsliding, and growing social agreement that honest money mattered. As you rest now, as your mind drifts between waking and sleeping, between attention and peaceful inattention, carry with you this image of progress. After centuries of debasement, of clipped coins and broken promises, of monetary chaos and commercial disruption, finally, slowly, reform was possible. The arc of monetary history doesn't bend automatically toward honesty. It took effort, vision, sacrifice, and persistence. But it did bend, at least for a time, in England in the early 1700s. The story doesn't end there, of course. New challenges were already emerging. Paper money was being invented and would create new opportunities for debasement without the physical limits that Newton's milled coins imposed. Colonial expansion and international trade would create new monetary complexity, and the fundamental tension between government's need for revenue and the economy's need for stable money would persist and evolve. But for a moment, briefly, the ancient problem of coin debasement had been solved through a combination of technology, science, law, and determination. Let that moment of achievement settle in your consciousness as we prepare to move forward. Newton at the Mint, applying the same rigorous thinking to money that he'd applied to physics, machines striking coins with mechanical precision, raised edges preventing the clipping that had plagued coinage for millennia. Trust slowly returning to England's monetary system. Economic growth following monetary reform. It's a hopeful story, a reminder that progress is possible, that human ingenuity and cooperation can solve even long-standing problems. But hope must be tempered with realism. The monetary reformers of the early 1700s had solved one problem, debased coinage, only to face new ones. The introduction of paper money, which we'll explore next, would prove that humanity's capacity for monetary manipulation was adaptable. When coins couldn't be clipped, notes could be printed. When silver content couldn't be reduced, money supply could be expanded. The specific techniques changed, but the underlying temptation remained constant. For now, though, rest in this period of achievement. Picture Newton in the Mint, examining new coins with the same careful attention he'd given to prisms and planets. Picture merchants handling coins without needing to weigh each one, trusting the standardization and the reeded edge. Picture a society learning slowly and imperfectly that honest dealing in money as in other things served everyone's long-term interest, even when it seemed costly in the short term. Picture the coins themselves stacked in treasuries and scattered in purses, each one a small promise kept, a tiny increment of trust restored. Let these images drift through your mind as you drift towards sleep, and know that we'll continue this story, following money's evolution from metal to paper to digits, from ancient times to our own, when you're ready to return to it. Sleep well, with the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes at least humans learn from history and make things better. Sometimes. Newton's reforms had solved the problem of clipping coins. But they couldn't solve a deeper problem. Even the most perfectly minted coin had limitations. Silver and gold were heavy and bulky. Transporting large amounts was difficult and dangerous. A merchant travelling with substantial funds risked robbery. Even storing precious metal was problematic. You needed secure vaults, guards, insurance of sorts. And there simply wasn't enough gold and silver in the world to support a rapidly growing economy if every transaction required physical metal. The solution that emerged was paper money, notes that represented value but weren't themselves made of precious material. The concept was elegant. A goldsmith or a bank would hold your gold in safekeeping and give you a paper receipt. That receipt could be traded as if it were the gold itself, with everyone understanding that it could be redeemed for actual gold at any time. The paper was more convenient than the metal, easier to transport and handle, yet backed by something real and valuable. This system worked as long as trust held. The paper note was only as good as the institution that issued it. If you doubted that the bank actually had the gold to redeem the note became worthless paper. The whole edifice of paper money rested on a fragile foundation of confidence and trust. Early forms of paper money had existed in China as far back as the 7th century, though those experiments had ended badly, with governments printing too much and causing inflation. In Europe, paper money developed more gradually in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Goldsmiths in London had been issuing receipts for gold deposits that circulated as a form of money. The Bank of England, established in 1694, issued notes that were promises to pay the bearer in gold or silver. These notes circulated and were accepted in trade, serving as money even though they were just paper. But the real test of paper money, the dramatic demonstration of both its possibilities and its dangers, came in France in the early 18th century through the schemes of a Scottish financier named John Law. His story is worth telling slowly and carefully because it reveals patterns that would repeat throughout the history of paper money, right down to our own time. John Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671. The son of a goldsmith and banker, he was brilliant, charming and reckless. In his youth, he killed a man in a duel in London and fled to the continent to avoid execution. He spent years travelling through Europe, gambling professionally, studying finance and economics, and developing theories about money and banking that were simultaneously insightful and dangerously naive. Law understood something important. He understood that money is, in essence, credit, a claim on future value. He understood that an economy's productive capacity could be limited not by real resources, but by lack of money to facilitate transactions. If you had workers who wanted to work, raw materials available, and customers who wanted to buy, but simply lacked the money to make the transactions happen, then creating more money could unlock real economic growth. This insight was ahead of its time and contained genuine truth, but Law made a fatal error. He believed that because money was essentially credit, it didn't need to be backed by anything physical like gold or silver. You could simply create it based on the expected future productivity of the economy. Print money today, and the economic growth it enables tomorrow would justify it. This was a theory that, pushed to its logical extreme, meant unlimited money creation was not just possible but desirable. In 1715, France was in desperate financial shape. The wars of Louis XIV had left the crown deeply in debt. The tax system was inefficient and corrupt. The economy was stagnant. The young King Louis XV was only 5 years old, and the regent, the Duke of Orleans, was searching for solutions to France's problems. John Law appeared with promises that seemed almost magical. Law proposed establishing a bank, the Banque Générale, that would issue paper money backed not by precious metal, but by the productive capacity of France itself. This money would stimulate trade and industry. The increased economic activity would generate tax revenues to pay down the debt. Everyone would prosper. The regent, desperate and intrigued, gave Law permission to proceed. At first, everything worked beautifully. Law's bank issued notes that were redeemable in silver. Because the notes were more convenient than carrying silver, and because Law's bank was perceived as more reliable than the chaotic royal finances, the notes gained acceptance. Trade did increase. There was a feeling of renewed energy in the French economy. Law was celebrated as a genius who had unlocked France's potential. Emboldened by this initial success, Law expanded his ambitions. He established the Mississippi Company, which was granted a monopoly on trade with France's Louisiana territory in North America. Louisiana was vast, the Mississippi River drainage basin stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, and largely unexplored. Law painted vivid pictures of the wealth that could be extracted from these territories. Gold and silver mines, fertile farmland, opportunities for trade with Native Americans. The possibilities seemed limitless. Law offered shares in the Mississippi Company to the public. To make the shares accessible, he allowed people to buy them with government debt, those nearly worthless bonds the Crown had issued to finance its wars. This was clever. It gave people a way to convert their worthless government bonds into shares of what seemed like a promising enterprise. It also helped the government by removing debt from circulation, and it created enormous demand for Mississippi Company shares. The share price began to rise. As it rose, more people wanted to buy, driving the price higher still. Law issued more shares to meet demand. People borrowed money to buy shares, confident the price would keep rising. Stories circulated of servants and seamstresses becoming wealthy overnight through share purchases. The frenzy of speculation became intense, almost religious in its fervour. The street where Law's offices were located, the Rue Quincampoix in Paris, was packed daily with people trying to buy shares. By 1720, Mississippi Company shares had risen from their initial price of around 500 livres to over 10,000 livres. On paper, enormous fortunes had been created. Law himself became one of the wealthiest men in Europe. He was given official positions, Controller General of Finances for France, unprecedented for a foreigner and a Protestant. He seemed to have accomplished the impossible, making France wealthy through the creation of paper value. But the whole structure rested on illusions layered upon illusions. The Mississippi Territory wasn't producing vast wealth. French settlements there were small and struggling. The supposed gold and silver mines didn't exist. The company's actual revenues were minimal. The share price was supported entirely by speculation. People buying because they thought the price would rise, not because the underlying asset was valuable. And Law had made an even more fundamental error. He had merged his bank with the Mississippi Company and with the French government's finances. The Banque Générale became the Banque Royale, a state bank. It issued notes not backed by silver, but by Mississippi Company shares. The government accepted these notes for taxes and insisted they be accepted in all transactions. The entire French economy became dependent on confidence in Law's system. This meant that when confidence began to crack, everything cracked at once. And crack it did, in 1720. Some investors, having made enormous paper profits, decided to convert their shares and banknotes into actual gold and silver while they still could. As word spread that people were redeeming notes for metal, others rushed to do the same. The bank's reserves of precious metal were nowhere near sufficient to redeem all the notes it had issued. Law responded by printing more notes, which only accelerated the loss of confidence. He tried to prop up the share price by having the bank buy shares, but this required printing even more notes. He passed laws restricting gold ownership and limiting the amount of precious metal people could possess, trying to force them to use paper. He decreed that Mississippi Company shares must maintain a minimum value. None of it worked. You cannot legislate trust. By the fall of 1720, the system was collapsing. The share price plummeted from over 10,000 livres to nearly worthless. The paper money lost most of its value. People who had been wealthy on paper discovered their wealth was an illusion. Riots broke out. Law fled France in December of 1720, disguised, narrowly escaping with his life. He died in poverty in Venice 9 years later. The Mississippi Bubble, as it became known, was France's first great experiment with paper money, and it ended in catastrophe. The economic damage was severe. People who had converted real wealth into shares or paper money lost everything. Foreign investors lost confidence in French finance. The French government's credit was destroyed. But perhaps more damaging was the psychological impact. An entire generation of French people learned not to trust paper money, not to trust banks, not to trust financial innovation. This skepticism would persist for decades and would contribute to France's later financial problems and eventually to revolution. What had gone wrong? At its core, Law's system failed because it confused the symbol with the substance. Paper money is a claim on real value, but it isn't itself real value. You can print as many notes as you want, but if those notes represent claims on wealth that doesn't exist, they're worthless. Law had created an enormous pyramid of paper claims resting on a tiny foundation of real assets. When people tried to convert their claims into something tangible, the pyramid collapsed. The Mississippi Bubble paralleled a similar mania happening simultaneously in England. The South Sea Bubble, involving the South Sea Company and similar dynamics of speculation and collapse. Both episodes demonstrated that paper money and financial markets created new possibilities for disaster. You couldn't clip paper money, but you could print too much of it. You couldn't reduce the precious metal content of a banknote, but you could reduce the real assets backing it. Interestingly, John Law wasn't simply a con man or a fool. Many of his insights about money and banking were sophisticated and prescient. The idea that money supply should match economic needs, that credit creation could stimulate growth, that rigid adherence to metallic standards could constrain prosperity. These ideas contain truth. Modern central banking incorporates some of Law's insights, but Law lacked the institutional constraints and caution necessary to implement his ideas safely. He was given too much power, moved too quickly, and allowed speculation to replace substance. After Law's disaster, most European countries became deeply suspicious of paper money issued by governments or government-chartered companies. The lesson seemed clear. Paper money inevitably led to overissue and inflation. The only trustworthy money was metallic coin of proper weight and purity, perhaps supplemented by private banknotes backed by and redeemable for gold or silver. But the practical advantages of paper were too great to abandon entirely. Trade continued to grow. Economies became more complex. The sheer volume of transactions needed to support commerce exceeded what was practical with purely metallic currency. So paper money persisted, usually issued by private banks and carefully managed to maintain convertibility into metal. The key was the discipline imposed by that convertibility. If a bank issued too many notes, people would redeem them for gold, draining the bank's reserves and forcing it to contract its note issue. The gold standard, not yet formalized but increasingly influential, imposed automatic limits on money creation. The American colonies had their own troubled experiences with paper money. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued continental dollars, paper money, to finance the war. These notes weren't backed by gold or silver. They were backed only by the promise that they could be redeemed for something of value after independence was won. The problem was that the Congress kept printing more of them. By the end of the war, it's estimated that over $200 million in continental currency had been issued. Prices rose 25-fold or more. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered the language as a synonym for worthless. Soldiers who'd been paid in continental dollars found their pay almost worthless. Farmers who'd sold produce to the army for continental dollars were ruined when the currency collapsed. Creditors who'd lent money were repaid in currency worth a fraction of what they'd lent. It was a form of default, of theft through inflation, even though there was no physical clipping of coins. The mechanism was different, but the effect was the same as ancient or medieval debasement. The experience with continental currency made the framers of the American Constitution deeply suspicious of paper money. The Constitution gave Congress the power to coin money, but said nothing about paper money, an omission that many scholars believe was intentional. The founding generation had seen paper money's dangers firsthand and wanted to prevent its repetition, yet paper money's practical advantages meant it kept returning. State banks issued their own notes, private banks did the same. By the early 19th century, hundreds of different banks across America were issuing their own paper money, each note a promise by that particular bank to pay the bearer in gold or silver. This created confusion. A note from a Massachusetts bank might trade at a discount in Virginia because people weren't sure if the bank was sound. Counterfeiters flourished because it was impossible to know what all the legitimate notes looked like. The system was chaotic, but at least the discipline of convertibility imposed some limits. France had another. Even more dramatic experience with paper money during the Revolution. When the revolutionaries overthrew Louis XVI in 1789, they inherited a bankrupt state. The solution they hit upon was to issue paper money called assignats, backed by land confiscated from the church and from aristocratic émigrés who'd fled France. The land was valuable and abundant, so the assignats seemed well backed. Initially, the assignats held their value. But the government faced enormous expenses, defending against foreign invasion, suppressing internal rebellion, feeding Paris. The temptation to print more assignats was irresistible, and unlike Law's banknotes, assignats weren't even redeemable on demand. They were supposed to be usable to purchase the confiscated land, but that land would be sold gradually, not immediately. The printing presses ran day and night. From an initial issue of 400 million livres in assignats in 1790, the total in circulation grew to nearly 45 billion livres by 1796. Prices rose accordingly. A pound of bread that cost a few sous before the Revolution cost hundreds of livres in assignats by 1795. Wages couldn't keep pace with prices. People on fixed incomes were ruined. Savings evaporated. The government tried the same failed remedies that had been tried before. Price controls. Anyone selling above the maximum price could be guillotined during the Terror, but still prices rose because the underlying problem was too much money chasing too few goods. Forced acceptance of assignats. You had to accept them at face value or face punishment. But this just drove commerce underground. Patriotic appeals, supporting the currency was supporting the revolution, but patriotism doesn't make worthless paper valuable. By 1796, the assignat system had collapsed completely. The notes were essentially worthless. A new paper currency, the mandat territorial, was introduced to replace the assignats, but it failed even more quickly. France returned to a metallic currency, and again, a generation learned to distrust paper money. The pattern across these episodes is consistent and instructive. Paper money begins with good intentions and apparent soundness. It's backed by something: land, company shares, the productive capacity of the economy, future tax revenues. At first it works. Commerce expands. The economy seems to improve. Confidence grows. But then pressures mount. War, expensive projects, government debt. The temptation to issue more paper money becomes overwhelming. More is issued, and more, and more. The backing becomes less and less substantial relative to the amount of paper in circulation. Prices rise. Confidence erodes. The system collapses. This is debasement in a new form. Instead of reducing the silver content of coins while maintaining their face value, you're increasing the quantity of money while maintaining each unit's nominal value. The effect is the same. Each unit of currency buys less than it used to. The cause is the same: government's inability or unwillingness to finance itself honestly through taxation. The victims are the same: people who hold currency or are owed fixed sums, particularly workers on wages and people living on fixed incomes. But paper money also offered something genuinely valuable. It could expand and contract with the economy's needs in ways that metallic currency could not. In principle, you could manage paper money intelligently, issuing more when the economy was growing to prevent deflation, issuing less when it was overheating to prevent inflation. This required wisdom and discipline, but it was theoretically possible. The challenge was institutional. How do you create a system that captures paper money's advantages while preventing its abuses? How do you give someone the power to issue currency but prevent them from issuing too much? How do you maintain the discipline that gold convertibility imposed while allowing the flexibility that purely metallic currency lacked? These questions would occupy economists and policymakers throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Various answers were tried: central banks with varying degrees of independence, rules about what could back paper money, constitutional restrictions on money printing, international agreements. Some worked better than others. None worked perfectly. The tension between flexibility and discipline, between government's need for revenue and the economy's need for stable money, persisted. As you drift now between waking and sleeping, between following this story and letting it fade into background, hold in your mind the image of paper, just paper, with ink and designs and promises printed on it, claiming to be worth gold or silver or land or future production. Think about the leap of faith required to accept such paper as money, to trade real goods for it, to save it for future needs. Think about how easily that faith can be betrayed, how tempting it is for those who control the printing press to print just a little more, and a little more, until the paper is worthless. The history we've traced from Law's Mississippi scheme through the continental dollars to the French assignats shows that every generation seems to need to learn this lesson anew. Paper money can work, but only with discipline and restraint and institutions strong enough to prevent abuse. Without those safeguards, paper money inevitably leads to overissue, to inflation, to the destruction of savings and the disruption of commerce. It's the same story as clipping coins, just with different technology. The 19th century would see continued experiments with paper money, continued failures and occasional successes, and eventually the development of more sophisticated central banking, but that's ahead of us. For now, rest with these early experiments, these dramatic failures, these demonstrations that changing the technology of money doesn't change human nature. The temptation to create more money than the economy can support, to finance today's expenses by destroying tomorrow's value, remains constant whether the money is gold coins or paper notes, or, as we'll see, digital entries in computer systems. Let the Mississippi bubble deflate in your imagination, let the assignats flutter down worthless, let John Law flee into exile and the continental dollars become not worth a continental. These failures taught lessons that some learned and others ignored, that some remembered and others forgot. The story of money is a story of this ongoing struggle between the wisdom of restraint and the temptation of easy solutions, between the discipline of honest value and the allure of paper promises. Sleep now, knowing we'll return to trace how this struggle continued, how paper money evolved from these catastrophic failures to become the foundation of modern economies, and how the same old temptations found new expressions in new eras. The disasters of the 18th century didn't end paper money. They couldn't, because the advantages were too compelling and the need was too great. As economies grew, as trade expanded, as the Industrial Revolution transformed production and commerce, the world needed more money to facilitate more transactions. The question wasn't whether to use paper money, but how to use it responsibly. How to capture its benefits while avoiding the catastrophes we've just explored. The 19th century saw the gradual development of what would become the classical gold standard, a system where paper money existed but was strictly disciplined by convertibility into gold at a fixed rate. This wasn't invented all at once or adopted everywhere simultaneously. It evolved over decades through trial and error, through crises and reforms, through the accumulated experience of what worked and what didn't. England led the way, though somewhat accidentally. After the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, Britain returned to the gold standard that had been suspended during the war. The pound sterling was defined as a specific weight of gold, approximately 1/4 of an ounce. Paper notes issued by the Bank of England were redeemable for gold at this fixed rate. This meant that if you held a £5 note, you could take it to the Bank of England and exchange it for actual gold sovereigns worth £5. This convertibility imposed discipline. The Bank of England couldn't simply print unlimited notes because if it printed too many, people would redeem them for gold, draining the bank's gold reserves. When gold reserves fell too low, the bank had to contract the money supply, issue fewer notes, raise interest rates to reduce borrowing, take steps to increase gold inflows. This was often painful. Causing recessions and unemployment, but it prevented the kind of runaway inflation that had destroyed the assignats and continental currency. Other countries gradually adopted similar systems. The United States went through various monetary arrangements, state banknotes, private currencies, greenbacks issued during the Civil War, before settling on a gold standard in the 1870s. Germany adopted the gold standard in 1871. France, despite its traumatic history with paper money, eventually established a gold-backed currency. By the late 19th century, most major economies operated on some version of the gold standard. The system had appealing features. It provided an automatic mechanism for balancing trade between countries. If Britain imported more than it exported, gold would flow out to pay for those imports. This reduced Britain's money supply, which lowered prices, which made British goods more competitive, which increased exports and reduced imports, which brought gold back. The system was self-correcting, at least in theory. The gold standard also provided stability and predictability. If you knew a pound was worth a quarter ounce of gold, and that relationship was fixed, you could make long-term contracts and plans with confidence. International trade was simplified because currencies had stable relationships to each other through their common relationship to gold. A British merchant and an American merchant both knew that their currencies were backed by gold and could calculate exchange rates easily. But the gold standard had serious limitations and costs. The money supply was limited by the amount of gold available, which meant it couldn't grow as fast as the economy sometimes needed. When gold discoveries were made, in California in the 1840s, in Australia in the 1850s, in South Africa in the 1880s, the money supply could expand, sometimes causing inflation. When gold was scarce, the money supply contracted, causing deflation and recessions. Deflation might sound good, prices falling. Your money buying more, but it was actually quite harmful. If prices were falling, businesses and farmers struggled because the goods they sold were worth less, while their debts remained fixed in nominal terms. A farmer who borrowed $1,000 to buy land would have to repay that $1,000, even if the wheat he grew was now selling for half its previous price. Deflation transferred wealth from debtors to creditors, from farmers and entrepreneurs to banks and bondholders. The late 19th century saw fierce political debates about monetary policy, particularly in the United States. Farmers and workers, who tended to be debtors, wanted more money in circulation to raise prices and reduce the real burden of their debts. They advocated for quote 5, using both gold and silver as backing for currency, which would expand the money supply because silver was more plentiful than gold. Bankers and creditors wanted to maintain the pure gold standard, which kept money scarce and valuable. The election of 1896 turned largely on this issue. William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate, gave his famous quote 6 speech, declaring quote 7 he lost to William McKinley, who supported the gold standard. But the passion of the debate showed how deeply monetary policy affected people's lives. This wasn't abstract economics. It was about whether farmers could keep their land, whether workers could earn decent wages, whether debtors would be crushed or relieved. The gold standard survived these challenges and entered the 20th century as the international monetary order. But its rigidity would prove problematic when the world faced unprecedented shocks. The First World War, beginning in 1914, created financial pressures that the gold standard couldn't accommodate. Wars are expensive. They require governments to mobilize resources on a massive scale, paying soldiers, manufacturing weapons, purchasing supplies. Taxation can provide some revenue, but war expenses typically far exceed what can be raised through taxes, especially quickly. Governments needed to borrow, and they needed to create money. But the gold standard limited their ability to do both. One by one, the warring nations suspended gold convertibility. Britain, France, Germany, Russia all abandoned the gold standard to finance the war. They printed money, issued bonds, did whatever was necessary to fund the conflict. The result was significant inflation in all the belligerent countries. Prices roughly doubled in Britain and France during the war. In Germany, inflation was worse and would become catastrophic after the war. The war also disrupted international trade and gold flows. Gold accumulated in the United States, which entered the war late and whose territory wasn't fought over. European nations lost gold paying for American supplies. The neat balance of payments mechanism that the gold standard was supposed to provide broke down entirely. After the war ended in 1918, there was a strong desire to return to quotate, which meant returning to the gold standard. The gold standard represented stability, order, the comfortable world of before the war. Britain returned to gold in 1925, at the pre-war parity. A pound was again worth a quarter ounce of gold, the same as it had been in 1914. This decision, made by Winston Churchill, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, would later be recognised as a mistake. The problem was that prices in Britain had risen during and after the war. Returning to the old gold parity meant British prices were too high relative to gold and to other currencies. British exports became uncompetitive. The economy struggled with unemployment and stagnation throughout the late 1920s. Churchill himself later admitted that returning to gold at the old parity was the worst decision he ever made. Other countries faced similar challenges. France had experienced even more inflation than Britain. Returning to the pre-war gold parity was impossible. It would have required devastating deflation. Instead, France returned to gold at a new, devalued rate in 1928. The franc was worth less gold than before the war, which meant the government had effectively reduced the value of all debts denominated in francs. This was debasement through revaluation, similar to what medieval kings had done when they recoined currency at new weights. But the country that experienced the most extreme monetary disaster in the aftermath of World War I was Germany. The Weimar Republic, established after Germany's defeat, faced impossible financial pressures. The Treaty of Versailles imposed massive reparations, compensation that Germany was required to pay to the victorious Allies. The exact amount was unclear for several years, but eventually settled at 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum. Germany's economy was devastated by the war. Its industrial capacity was reduced, its territory was diminished, its government was unstable. The reparations burden seemed impossible to bear through normal taxation and economic growth. The government tried to negotiate reductions in the reparations, but the Allies, particularly France, insisted on full payment. Faced with obligations it couldn't meet, the German government did what governments throughout history have done when they need more money than they can raise honestly. It printed currency. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, began creating marks to pay government expenses and reparations. At first, the inflation was modest, but it accelerated slowly at first, then with gathering speed. In 1920, $1 American was worth about 64 marks. By 1921, it was worth 200 marks. These numbers might not seem catastrophic, but they represented a fundamental loss of confidence. And once confidence begins to erode in a currency, the erosion can accelerate rapidly. People who hold currency want to spend it quickly before it loses more value. This increased velocity of money, how quickly it changes hands, compounds the inflation. Merchants raise prices preemptively, expecting the currency to be worth less tomorrow. The government prints more to cover the same expenses because each mark buys less. It's a vicious spiral. By January of 1923, the exchange rate was about 18,000 marks to the dollar. By July, it was 160,000 to the dollar, and then things truly spun out of control. In August, the rate was 1 million marks to the dollar. In September, 13 million. In October, 25 billion. By November of 1923, the exchange rate reached 4 trillion marks to the dollar. Let's pause and try to comprehend what this meant for ordinary Germans living through it. Imagine you're a school teacher in Berlin, or a shopkeeper, or a factory worker, or a retired person living on a pension. In the morning, you receive your pay or your pension payment, a stack of banknotes so thick it requires a basket or a wheelbarrow to carry. You rush to spend it immediately because by afternoon, prices will have risen again. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 cost 100 marks in 1922 and 200 billion marks in November 1923. People papered their walls with banknotes because the paper was more valuable than the currency printed on it. Children built blocks out of stacks of worthless bills. Stoves were fueled with currency because it was cheaper than firewood. Stories from this period sound almost fantastical, but are well documented. A woman carrying a basket full of marks stopped to look in a shop window. When she returned moments later, the basket had been stolen, but the marks were dumped on the sidewalk. The thief wanted the basket, not the currency. a man ordered a cup of coffee, and by the time he finished it, the price had doubled. Workers were paid twice a day and would rush out during their lunch break to buy anything they could before the money became worthless. Savings were wiped out. If you had carefully saved money for retirement or for your children's education, it became worthless. People who had lent money were repaid in currency worth a tiny fraction of what they'd lent. Anyone on a fixed income, pensioners, widows, orphans living on inheritance, was reduced to destitution. The middle class, which had accumulated savings and lived on interest and pensions, was destroyed. This wasn't just an economic catastrophe. It was a social and psychological trauma. People's trust in institutions, in government, in the future was shattered. The hyperinflation of 1923 created a generation of Germans who never forgot, who remained deeply suspicious of government and paper money, who were susceptible to extremist political movements that promised to restore order and dignity. The inflation was finally stopped in November of 1923 through the introduction of a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by real estate and industrial assets. The old marks were exchanged at a rate of 1 trillion to 1. 1 Rentenmark for 1 trillion marks. This sounds arbitrary, but it worked because it marked a clear break. The new currency was different. The government credibly committed not to print unlimited amounts of it. People tentatively trusted it, and that trust allowed the economy to stabilize. But the damage was done. The hyperinflation contributed to the political instability that would eventually bring Hitler to power a decade later. Economic trauma creates political consequences. When people's savings are destroyed, when they feel betrayed by their government and their institutions, they become desperate for someone who promises strength and restoration. The path from the printing press of 1923 to the rise of Nazism isn't direct or simple, but there is a connection. The Weimar hyperinflation was the most extreme example, but similar patterns appeared elsewhere. Austria, Hungary, Poland all experienced severe inflation in the aftermath of World War I. Russia, in the chaos of revolution and civil war, saw its currency collapse completely. These weren't mysterious natural disasters. They were the result of governments printing money to finance expenses they couldn't or wouldn't pay for through taxation. The pattern should be familiar by now. It's the same pattern we saw with John Law's Mississippi scheme, with the continental dollars. With the assignats, government faces financial pressure, government prints money, inflation results, confidence erodes, hyperinflation destroys the currency. The mechanisms differ, printing paper money versus clipping coins, but the underlying dynamic is identical. Create more money than real economic growth justifies, and you debase the currency just as surely as a medieval king mixing copper into silver. The hyperinflations of the 1920s taught important lessons. They demonstrated that there is no free lunch in monetary policy. You cannot solve real economic problems simply by printing more money. Money is a claim on real resources, goods, services, labour. If you create more claims without creating more resources, you just dilute each claim's value. It's elementary logic, yet governments keep forgetting it or hoping they can somehow evade it. The Great Depression of the 1930s created different monetary challenges. The problem wasn't too much money, but too little. As we discussed in the earlier part of our story about the Depression, banks failed, the money supply contracted, deflation set in. Prices fell, but this deflation was harmful rather than beneficial. It made debts harder to pay, discouraged spending and investment, deepened the economic collapse. Countries responded differently to the Depression, and their monetary policies significantly affected their recovery. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, allowing the pound to depreciate. This made British exports more competitive and helped the economy recover. The United States stayed on gold longer, but eventually devalued the dollar in 1933 under Franklin Roosevelt. France clung to the gold standard until 1936 and suffered a longer, deeper depression as a result. The experience suggested that the gold standard, for all its virtues of stability and discipline, was too rigid for a complex modern economy. When a crisis hit, countries needed monetary flexibility, the ability to expand the money supply to prevent deflation, to devalue the currency to restore competitiveness. The gold standard prevented this flexibility, turning what might have been severe recessions into catastrophic depressions. Yet the alternative, paper money with no metallic backing, had proven dangerous. Without the discipline of gold convertibility, governments tended to print too much money, causing inflation or hyperinflation. The challenge was finding a middle path, enough flexibility to respond to economic conditions, enough discipline to prevent monetary abuse. The Second World War, like the First, forced countries to abandon or suspend the gold standard. War financing again required governments to print money and borrow on a massive scale. This time governments were more sophisticated in how they did it. They imposed price controls, rationed goods, managed the inflation to some degree. But prices still rose significantly in all the belligerent nations. By the war's end in 1945, the old monetary order was clearly finished. The classical gold standard was dead. The world needed a new system, one that could provide stability while allowing necessary flexibility, that could prevent both the hyperinflations of the 1920s and the deflations of the 1930s, the system that emerged from negotiations at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. In 1944 would be the next chapter in this long story of how to manage money honestly. But that system and its eventual breakdown belong to our next part of the journey. For now, rest with the lessons of the first half of the 20th century. Paper money could work, but required careful management. Printing too much caused inflation and hyperinflation. Printing too little caused deflation and depression. The gold standard provided discipline, but at a high cost in economic flexibility. War and crisis tempted governments to monetary excess. Trust once destroyed was very difficult to rebuild. These lessons had been learned painfully, through the suffering of millions who saw their savings wiped out by inflation, their jobs destroyed by deflation, their lives disrupted by monetary chaos. The people who lived through the Weimar hyperinflation, who stood in line with wheelbarrows of currency to buy bread, who watched their life savings become worthless paper, they carried those memories forever. The same for those who lived through the oppression's deflation, who couldn't find work because the money supply had contracted, who lost their homes to foreclosure because they couldn't pay debts in increasingly scarce and valuable currency. Money seems abstract, just numbers and paper and promises. But these numbers and paper and promises represent real things. People's labour, their savings, their hopes for the future. When money's managed badly, when it's debased through inflation or made too scarce through deflation, real people suffer real consequences. That's the through line in all these stories, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe to 20th century Germany. The technology changes, the specific mechanisms change, but the human impact of monetary mismanagement remains constant. Let these stories settle in your mind as you drift towards sleep. Picture the German housewife in 1923, rushing to spend her pay before it became worthless. Picture the British worker in the 1920s, unable to find work because the pound was overvalued. Picture the American farmer in the 1890s, crusading against the gold standard that was crushing him with debt. These aren't abstract economic principles. They're human stories, human struggles, human suffering caused by decisions about money made by distant authorities who often didn't understand or didn't care about the consequences. The 20th century would continue these struggles, would develop new institutions and new approaches, would experience new crises and attempt new solutions, but it would also repeat old patterns, make familiar mistakes, rediscover ancient truths. The story of money is a story of this ongoing tension between wisdom learned and wisdom forgotten, between the discipline of honest money and the temptation of easy solutions, between long-term stability and short-term expedience. Sleep now, and we'll continue this story when you return, tracing how the world moved from the gold standard's collapse through the Bretton Woods system to the fully fiat currencies of our own time. And considering what it all means, the delegates who gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July of 1944 understood they were designing the financial architecture for the post-war world. The war was still raging. D-Day had occurred only a month earlier, but Allied victory seemed increasingly certain. The question was what kind of world would emerge from the devastation. The Great Depression and the war itself had demonstrated that the old system was broken. The classical gold standard had collapsed under the pressures of war and economic crisis. Competitive devaluations. In the 1930s, countries racing to lower the value of their currencies to boost exports had worsened the depression and increased international tensions. The monetary chaos had contributed to political extremism and ultimately to war. A new system was needed, one that could provide stability without the gold standard's rigidity. The Bretton Woods Conference, led primarily by John Maynard Keynes representing Britain and Harry Dexter White representing the United States, created a system that tried to capture the best of both worlds. Currencies would have fixed exchange rates, providing stability for international trade, but these rates could be adjusted when necessary, providing flexibility. And the entire system would be anchored by the American dollar, which alone would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This arrangement reflected the new reality of global power. The United States had emerged from the war as the dominant economic force, holding most of the world's gold reserves. Other countries' currencies weren't backed by gold. They were backed by dollars, which were backed by gold. It was a gold standard once removed, with the dollar as the linchpin of the entire system. The system worked remarkably well for about 25 years. The post-war period saw unprecedented economic growth in Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. International trade expanded rapidly. Exchange rate stability encouraged investment and commerce. It seemed the architects of Bretton Woods had succeeded in creating a monetary order that combined discipline with flexibility. But the system contained inherent tensions that would eventually tear it apart. The United States had to maintain sufficient gold reserves to redeem dollars at $35 per ounce if foreign governments requested conversion. This meant American monetary policy was constrained. If the US ran large trade deficits, dollars would accumulate abroad, and foreign governments might demand gold in exchange. To maintain confidence in the dollar, the US needed to limit inflation and maintain economic discipline. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, this constraint held. The United States economy was strong, inflation was low, the dollar was trusted globally. American products dominated world markets. The system hummed along smoothly, with only occasional adjustments needed when particular currencies became obviously over or undervalued. But the 1960s brought new pressures. The United States became increasingly involved in the Vietnam War, which was expensive and lengthy. President Lyndon Johnson also launched the Great Society programs, ambitious domestic spending on education, healthcare, poverty reduction. Johnson wanted both guns and butter, war abroad, and expanded social programs at home. He was unwilling to raise taxes sufficiently to pay for both. The result was increasing budget deficits financed partly by monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, created more money to help finance government spending. This began to generate inflation. American prices rose faster than prices in other countries. This made American exports less competitive and imports more attractive. The US trade balance deteriorated. Dollars accumulated overseas as the US imported more than it exported. Foreign governments, particularly France under President Charles de Gaulle, began to question whether the United States had enough gold to redeem all the dollars held abroad. De Gaulle didn't simply question, he acted. France began systematically converting dollars into gold, draining American gold reserves. Other countries watched nervously, some beginning to convert dollars as well. By the late 1960s, it was becoming clear that the Bretton Woods system was under strain. The United States held about $11 billion worth of gold, but had issued perhaps $40 billion in claims against that gold. Simple arithmetic suggested that if foreign governments all tried to convert their dollars, there wouldn't be enough gold to go around. This created a paradox economists called the Triffin dilemma, named after the Belgian economist Robert Triffin, who identified it. For the world economy to grow, it needed more dollars to facilitate increasing trade. But for the dollar to remain credible as a gold-backed currency, the US couldn't issue too many dollars relative to its gold reserves. The system required contradictory things, expansion and restraint simultaneously. Various stopgap measures were tried. The gold pool, an arrangement where major central banks cooperated to stabilize the gold price, was established in 1961 and collapsed in 1968. Two-tier gold pricing was introduced, with official transactions at $35 per ounce, but private market transactions at floating prices. Special drawing rights, a kind of synthetic reserve currency created by the International Monetary Fund, were introduced to supplement dollars and reduce demand for gold. None of these measures addressed the fundamental problem. By 1971, the situation had become critical. The United States was running significant budget and trade deficits. Inflation was rising. Foreign governments held enormous quantities of dollars and were increasingly skeptical about American promises to redeem them for gold. The gold drain was accelerating. Something had to give. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made an announcement that would fundamentally alter the global monetary system. He declared that the United States would temporarily suspend convertibility of the dollar into gold. This, quote, 9 suspension, announced as a 90-day measure, would become permanent. The link between the dollar and gold, which had anchored the Bretton Woods system, was severed. The gold window was closed. Nixon's announcement was presented as protecting American interests against speculators and unfair foreign competition. The actual reason was simpler. The United States didn't have enough gold to redeem the dollars held abroad, and continuing to promise such redemption was becoming unsustainable. Rather than face the humiliation of running out of gold, Nixon ended convertibility. This decision, made by Nixon but really forced by the accumulated imbalances of the previous decade, marked the beginning of the era we still live in. The era of purely fiat currency, where money isn't backed by any physical commodity, where value rests entirely on trust in the issuing government. It was, in a sense, the culmination of the long evolution from metallic coins to paper money. The last link to physical commodity backing was broken. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Exchange rates that had been fixed for decades now floated, their values determined by market forces. Currencies gyrated wildly as markets tried to find appropriate values without the anchor of gold. International trade became more uncertain and risky, but gradually, over the course of the 1970s, a new system stabilized. Major currencies floated against each other. Central banks intervened occasionally to smooth excessive volatility, but generally let markets determine rates. The dollar remained the dominant reserve currency, not because it was backed by gold, but simply because the US economy was the largest and most stable. The 1970s, however, demonstrated some of the dangers of purely fiat money. Without the discipline of gold convertibility, governments were free to expand money supplies more aggressively. The result was inflation, particularly after oil prices spiked in 1973 and again in 1979. By the end of the 1970s, inflation in the United States was running at double-digit rates. Interest rates soared to the high teens. Savings were eroded. Economic growth stagnated even as prices rose, a combination called stagflation that conventional economic theory said was impossible. Other countries experienced worse inflation. In Latin America, several countries saw inflation rates of 100% per year or more. Argentina, Brazil, Chile all struggled with persistent high inflation that periodically tipped into hyperinflation. Israel experienced inflation exceeding 100% annually in the early 1980s. These weren't Weimar-level catastrophes, but they were serious economic disruptions that harmed ordinary people and destabilized societies. The pattern should be familiar. Without external constraints on money creation, governments tend to create too much money, especially when facing fiscal pressures. The gold standard had imposed constraints. You couldn't issue more currency than your gold reserve supported. The Bretton Woods system had imposed constraints. You had to maintain convertibility to dollars, which were convertible to gold. But purely fiat money had no automatic constraints. Discipline had to be self-imposed, and self-discipline has always been the hardest kind. The inflation of the 1970s eventually prompted a response. Paul Volcker, appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, deliberately engineered a severe recession to break the inflationary spiral. He raised interest rates dramatically. The prime rate reached over 20%, making borrowing extremely expensive. This caused unemployment to rise above 10% and created significant economic pain. But it worked. Inflation was brought under control, falling from double digits to under 4% by 1983. Volcker's success demonstrated that fiat money could work, that inflation wasn't inevitable, but only if central bankers were willing to make difficult and unpopular decisions. The lesson was that institutional arrangements mattered enormously. A politically independent central bank committed to price stability could maintain honest money even without gold backing. But a central bank subservient to political pressures would tend toward inflation. Other countries learned similar lessons. Germany's Bundesbank, scarred by the memory of Weimar hyperinflation, maintained strict control over money creation and kept inflation low even as other European countries experienced higher inflation. This difference in inflation rates created tensions within Europe and eventually contributed to the movement toward a single European currency, but that's a later part of the story. The late 1980s and 1990s saw the development of what economists called the Great Moderation, a period of relatively stable economic growth with low inflation in developed countries. Central banks had learned to manage fiat currencies. Inflation targeting became common. Central banks would explicitly aim to keep inflation around 2% annually, adjusting interest rates and money supply to hit this target. The system seemed to work. The terrors of the 1970s inflation seemed to have been tamed, but the Great Moderation bred complacency. If inflation was under control, maybe money supply didn't matter so much. Maybe central banks could be more accommodating, keeping interest rates low to support economic growth. After all, wasn't stable, moderate growth the goal? The constraints that had seemed so important, first gold, then the Bretton Woods dollar-gold link, then the tough monetarism of Volcker, maybe they were excessive. Maybe we'd figured out how to manage money responsibly without such strict limitations. The financial crisis of 2008 would test these assumptions severely. The crisis itself was triggered by problems in housing and financial markets, rather than by monetary policy directly. But the response to the crisis marked a new phase in the evolution of fiat money, one that brings us very close to our own present moment, when the financial system teetered on the edge of collapse in late 2008, central banks responded with unprecedented monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve lowered interest rates essentially to zero. When that wasn't enough, it began what was called quantitative easing, purchasing massive quantities of bonds and other securities, creating new money to pay for them. The Fed's balance sheet, which had been under $1 trillion before the crisis, expanded to over $4 trillion by 2014. Other major central banks followed similar policies. The European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, all engaged in massive money creation to combat the crisis and stimulate their economies. The money created didn't take the form of currency notes printed and distributed. It was mostly digital, entries in computer systems showing that banks had more reserves, that the central bank owned more securities, but it was money creation nonetheless, expansion of the monetary base on a scale that would have been unthinkable under the gold standard or even under the fiscal discipline of the early fiat money era. The rationale was clear. The financial crisis threatened to cause a repeat of the Great Depression. Deflation was a real risk as banks failed and credit contracted. Aggressive monetary expansion was necessary to prevent economic collapse, to maintain spending and investment, to support asset prices and confidence. And unlike the 1970s, this monetary expansion didn't immediately cause inflation. Prices remained relatively stable even as central bank balance sheets exploded. Why didn't inflation surge? Economists debated this. Some pointed to the severity of the recession, which kept demand weak. Some noted that much of the created money stayed in the financial system as bank reserves, rather than being lent out to the real economy. Some argued that globalization and technological change were exerting downward pressure on prices independent of monetary policy. Whatever the reasons, the expected inflation didn't materialize. This led some to conclude that the old fears about excessive money creation were outdated. We could, it seemed, create money on a massive scale, without triggering inflation as long as the economy had spare capacity, and as long as expectations remained anchored. This was a revolutionary idea, challenging centuries of monetary thinking. Maybe the constraints that had seemed so important, gold backing, limited money supply, central bank discipline, were less crucial than previously believed. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 prompted an even more dramatic test of this theory. Governments around the world responded to the pandemic with massive spending, supporting businesses forced to close, replacing lost incomes, funding healthcare responses. Much of this spending was financed by central bank money creation. In the United States, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet ballooned from about $4 trillion in early 2020 to nearly $9 trillion by early 2022. The money supply, measured by metrics like M2, which includes currency, checking accounts, and savings deposits, grew by over 25% in a single year, from early 2020 to early 2021. This was peacetime monetary expansion on a scale that had previously only occurred during major wars, and this time, unlike after 2008, inflation did follow. By late 2021, inflation rates in the United States were approaching 7%. By mid-2022, they exceeded 9%, the highest rate since the early 1980s. Other countries experienced similar patterns. The era of low, stable inflation seemed to have ended. Central banks initially characterized this inflation as transitory, caused by temporary supply chain disruptions and pandemic-related distortions. But as inflation persisted and broadened, this characterization became untenable. By late 2021, central banks began raising interest rates to combat inflation, following the playbook that Volcker had established in the early 1980s. But they were doing so from a position of enormous balance sheet expansion, and after over a decade of near-zero interest rates. The economy had become addicted to cheap money, and withdrawal would be painful. This brings us nearly to the present moment, to the world we inhabit now. We live in an era of purely fiat currency, where money is created by central banks without any commodity backing, where the discipline is supposed to come from institutional arrangements and central bank independence rather than from physical constraints. This system has provided tremendous flexibility, allowing aggressive responses to crises, supporting economic growth, preventing the deflations that plagued the gold standard era. But it has also revived ancient temptations. The ability to create money without physical constraint means governments can finance spending without the political difficulty of raising taxes. The mechanism is more sophisticated than medieval kings clipping coins or revolutionary governments printing assignats, but the essential dynamic is similar. create more money than real economic growth justifies, and you debase the currency through inflation. The question facing the world now is whether we've truly learned to manage fiat money responsibly, or whether we're simply in a longer cycle of the same pattern that has repeated throughout history. Can institutional arrangements and central bank independence provide sufficient discipline to prevent the inflationary excesses that have destroyed currencies in the past? Or will the temptation to monetize debt, to finance spending through money creation, to solve today's problems by creating tomorrow's inflation, prove irresistible as it has so many times before? These aren't abstract questions. They affect everyone who holds currency, who has savings, who receives wages or pensions denominated in fiat money. The purchasing power of these claims on future resources depends entirely on the restraint and wisdom of central bankers and governments. History suggests reasons for both hope and concern. We've developed better institutions, better understanding, better tools for managing money than our ancestors had. But we also face the same human temptations, the same political pressures, the same tendency to prioritize short-term benefits over long-term stability. As you rest now, as this story of 20th and 21st century money settles into your consciousness, reflect on the arc we've traced. From the gold standards discipline through the Bretton Woods Compromise to the purely fiat system of today. From the hyperinflations of the 1920s through the Great Moderation to the post-pandemic inflation. From the constraints of commodity backing to the flexibility and danger of unbacked currency. We've travelled far from medieval coin clippers and Roman denarius debasers, but we're still grappling with the same fundamental question. How do we create a monetary system that serves the economy's needs while maintaining stable value, that provides flexibility in crisis while preventing long-term debasement, that balances government's need for resources with citizens' need for honest money? The technology has changed dramatically, the understanding has deepened considerably, but the challenge remains essentially the same. The story continues, even now as central banks adjust policy, as governments make fiscal decisions, as inflation rises or falls, as new crises emerge and require response. We're living inside the story, unable to see how this chapter ends. But understanding the patterns of the past, the cycles of discipline and excess, the innovations and failures, the lessons learned and forgotten, helps us navigate the present with more wisdom. The past doesn't determine the future, but it illuminates it, showing us the paths that have led to prosperity and those that have led to ruin. Let these thoughts drift through your mind as you drift towards sleep. The great monetary experiments of the 20th century, the shift from gold to paper to digital entries, the ongoing struggle to maintain honest value in an era of unlimited money creation. We're all participants in this experiment, whether we realize it or not. Every time we accept payment in currency, every time we save money for the future, every time we trust that the numbers in our bank accounts will still buy something meaningful tomorrow. That trust, that acceptance, is what makes the whole system work. And that trust is what monetary debasement in all its forms across all the centuries slowly erodes. Sleep now, and we'll continue exploring how this ancient story manifests in our modern world when you return. The monetary system we inhabit today would be almost unrecognizable to someone from even 50 years ago, let alone to a medieval money changer or a Roman merchant. Money has become increasingly abstract, increasingly divorced from any physical reality. Most money exists only as numbers in computer systems, created and destroyed with keystrokes. Moving around the world at the speed of a light through fibre optic cables and wireless networks. Yet for all this technological transformation, the fundamental dynamics we've been exploring, the tension between discipline and flexibility, between honest value and debasement, remain remarkably constant. Let's think carefully about how modern central banks actually create money, because the process is so different from anything we've discussed so far that it requires patient explanation. When we think of printing money, We imagine literal printing presses churning out banknotes, and central banks do print physical currency, of course, but the vast majority of money creation today happens without any physical printing at all. It happens through what are called open market operations and more dramatically through quantitative easing. Here's how it works in its simplest form. Suppose the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, wants to increase the money supply. It doesn't print cash and hand it to people. Instead, it buys something, typically government bonds from banks. But where does the Fed get the money to buy these bonds? It simply creates it. An accountant at the Federal Reserve makes an electronic entry showing that the selling bank now has more reserves, more money on deposit at the Fed. That's it. Money has been created from nothing, with no printing press, no metal, no physical process at all. This might sound like magic or fraud, but it's how the system works and has worked for decades. The money created isn't fake. Those bank reserves can be used to make loans, to buy securities, to support the banking system. They're as real as any money, even though they're purely digital. But the ease of creation is unprecedented in human history. A medieval king who wanted to debase his coinage had to gather silver, mix it with copper, strike new coins, distribute them. A revolutionary government printing assignats had to run printing presses, distribute physical notes. A modern central bank just needs someone to update a computer database. This ease of creation makes the discipline question crucial. What prevents central banks from creating unlimited amounts of money? The answer is supposed to be institutional arrangements and mandates. Central banks in most developed countries are legally independent of direct political control and have explicit mandates to maintain price stability. The Federal Reserve, for instance, has a dual mandate to pursue maximum employment and stable prices. The European Central Bank has a primary mandate to maintain price stability, defined as inflation near but below 2%. These mandates are supposed to provide discipline. If the central bank creates too much money and inflation rises above the target, the bank is failing its mandate. Its leadership might be criticized, might lose credibility, might even be replaced. This reputational pressure, combined with the expertise and professionalism of central bankers, is supposed to prevent the kind of excessive money creation that led to the hyperinflations of the past. And for several decades, roughly from the mid-1980s through the 2000s, this system seemed to work well. Central banks in major economies maintained inflation at low, stable levels, usually around 2 to 3% annually. This was low enough that money maintained its value fairly well over time, but high enough to avoid deflation and to give monetary policy room to respond to recessions. It was a kind of Goldilocks outcome. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. But the financial crisis of 2008 forced central banks into uncharted territory. Traditional monetary policy works by adjusting short-term interest rates. When the economy needs stimulus, the central bank lowers rates, making borrowing cheaper and encouraging spending and investment. When the economy is overheating, the central bank raises rates, making borrowing more expensive and cooling things down. But by late 2008, short-term interest rates in the United States and many other countries were already near zero. They couldn't be lowered further. There's a lower bound called the zero lower bound. What could central banks do when conventional policy had reached its limits? The answer was quantitative easing, often abbreviated as QE. The Federal Reserve began purchasing not just short-term government bonds, which is normal practice, but long-term government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, and other assets. The goal was to lower long-term interest rates, to inject money into the financial system, to support asset prices, and generally to provide monetary stimulus when conventional rate cuts were impossible. The scale was unprecedented. In the first round of QE from late 2008 through early 2010, the Fed purchased about $1.75 trillion in securities. When that proved insufficient, a second round purchased another $600 billion. A third round, beginning in 2012, purchased $85 billion per month for an extended period. By the time QE was wound down in 2014, the Fed's balance sheet had grown from under $900 billion before the crisis to over $4.5 trillion. Think about those numbers for a moment. Over $3.5 trillion in new money created in about 6 years. This was money creation on a scale that would have triggered hyperinflation under the gold standard or under almost any historical monetary regime. Yet inflation remained low, generally below the Fed's 2% target. In fact, the Fed was worried about inflation being too low, about deflation risk, not about inflation being too high. Other central banks followed similar paths. The Bank of England engaged in quantitative easing. The Bank of Japan, which had pioneered such policies in the early 2000s, expanded them dramatically. The European Central Bank, initially hesitant, eventually adopted aggressive QE as well. Major central banks around the world were creating money on unprecedented scales. Why didn't this cause inflation immediately? This question puzzled economists and challenged traditional monetary theory. Several explanations emerged. First, the crisis had created a severe recession. Unemployment was high, capacity utilization was low, demand was weak. In such conditions, increasing the money supply doesn't necessarily raise prices because the economy has room to produce more goods and services to meet any increased demand. Second, much of the created money stayed in the financial system as bank reserves, rather than being lent out to businesses and consumers. Banks, traumatized by the crisis and facing new regulations, were cautious about lending. So the money sat in accounts at the Federal Reserve, not circulating through the economy in ways that would push up prices. Third, globalization and technological change were exerting downward pressure on many prices. Manufacturing could be done more cheaply overseas. Technology was making many goods and services less expensive. These forces counteracted the inflationary pressure from monetary expansion. And fourth, inflation expectations remained anchored. People and businesses expected inflation to remain around 2% because it had been around 2% for decades, and because they trusted the Fed to keep it there. These expectations became self-fulfilling. If people expect low inflation, they don't demand large wage increases or raise prices aggressively, which helps keep actual inflation low. But this fortunate outcome bred a certain complacency. If you could create trillions of dollars without triggering inflation, maybe the old warnings about excessive money creation were outdated. Maybe in a modern economy with spare capacity and anchored expectations, monetary expansion was largely consequence-free as long as you didn't go to Weimar extremes. This thinking influenced the response to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. When economies shut down to control the virus, governments needed to support businesses and workers who'd lost income through no fault of their own. The scale of support was in the United States. The CARES Act passed in March 2020 provided over $2 trillion in relief. Subsequent bills added trillions more. Other countries provided similar support scaled to their economies. Much of this spending was financed by central bank money creation. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which had been gradually declining from its post-crisis peak, reversed course and ballooned to nearly $9 trillion by early 2022. The money supply, measured by M2, increased by about $5.5 trillion, roughly 25%, in just 1 year from February 2020 to February 2021. This was monetary expansion far more rapid than anything since World War II. And this time, unlike after 2008, inflation followed. It started showing up in late 2021. Supply chain disruptions from the pandemic played a role. Factories shut down, shipping was delayed, certain goods became scarce. Stimulus checks and unemployment benefits put money in people's pockets, while lockdowns limited what they could spend it on, creating pent-up demand. When economies reopened, demand surged while supply remained constrained. By mid-2022, inflation in the United States exceeded 9%, the highest since the early 1980s. Europe experienced similar increases. Even countries that had struggled with deflation for decades, like Japan, saw inflation return. The era of near-zero inflation, which had seemed permanent, ended abruptly. Central banks responded by raising interest rates, though they were slow to act and initially underestimated inflation's persistence. The Federal Reserve began raising rates in March 2022 and continued through 2023, eventually taking rates above 5%. This was the most aggressive tightening cycle in decades, aimed at bringing inflation back to the 2% target. But raising rates after such massive monetary expansion created its own challenges. Many parts of the economy had become dependent on cheap money. Asset prices, stocks, real estate, cryptocurrencies, had been supported by low rates and ample liquidity. As rates rose and money became tighter, these assets fell in value. Some banks that had invested heavily in long-term bonds at low interest rates found themselves sitting on large losses when rates rose and bond prices fell. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank failed, followed by several other regional banks, raising fears of a broader banking crisis. The cycle was familiar from history: monetary expansion, inflation, tightening, crisis. The specific mechanisms were modern, but the pattern was ancient. Create too much money and you get inflation, contract too aggressively, and you risk financial instability and recession. Navigate this narrow path successfully, and you might achieve what's called a quote 13, bringing inflation down without causing severe recession. But soft landings are difficult and rare. What makes the current situation particularly interesting and concerning to some observers is the size of government debts. In the United States, federal debt held by the public exceeded 100% of GDP by 2023. Many other developed countries had similar or higher debt ratios. Servicing this debt, paying interest on it, becomes very expensive when interest rates rise. The US government's annual interest payments exceeded $1 trillion by 2024, a burden that strains the budget and creates pressure for either tax increases, spending cuts, or continued monetary accommodation. This creates a temptation that should be familiar from our historical exploration. When government debt is large and interest costs are burdensome, allowing some inflation reduces the real value of that debt. If you owe $1 trillion and inflation is 5%, the real value of what you owe decreases by 5% per year. Inflation is a way to partially default on debt without formally defaulting. It's not honest, but it's less politically painful than explicit default or the austerity required to pay debts in full. Some economists and historians watching the current situation see echoes of past debt crises that were resolved through inflation or currency debasement. After World War II, many countries had enormous war debts. These were largely inflated away over the following decades through a combination of financial repression, keeping interest rates artificially low through regulation, and moderate inflation. Savers and bondholders lost purchasing power, but governments escaped crushing debt burdens. Could something similar happen now? The official position of central banks is that they're committed to price stability, that they'll bring inflation back to 2% targets regardless of fiscal pressures. But history suggests that when governments face truly severe fiscal stress, monetary authorities often accommodate, allowing inflation to ease the debt burden. The independence of central banks is real but not absolute. Political pressure can be intense, especially in crisis. Some point to modern monetary theory, a controversial set of ideas arguing that governments that control their own currencies can't really run out of money, that they can simply create more to pay their bills, and that inflation is the only real constraint. MMT advocates argue this means governments should spend freely to achieve social goals, only pulling back if inflation becomes problematic. Critics see MMT as a recipe for the same inflationary disasters that have occurred throughout history, when governments printed money without restraint. The debate over MMT reveals the continued relevance of the ancient questions we've been exploring. Is there such a thing as too much money? Can governments create prosperity simply by creating currency? Or are there real constraints, resources, productivity, the willingness of people to hold currency that can't be overcome by monetary expansion? These questions were debated in John Law's time during the Signac crisis in Weimar Germany, and they're being debated now. Another modern development is the growth of private forms of money or money substitutes. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, created in 2009 in the aftermath of the financial crisis, represent an attempt to create money that can't be debased by government action. Bitcoin has a fixed maximum supply. Only 21 million bitcoins will ever be created, coded into its protocol. No central authority can decide to create more. This digital scarcity is intended to make Bitcoin immune to the inflationary debasement that has affected every government currency eventually. Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies have gained significant followings, particularly among those who distrust central banks and government money. The argument is straightforward. If history shows that governments always eventually debase their currencies, why not use a currency that mathematically cannot be debased? Bitcoin is sometimes called digital gold, a reference to gold's historical role as money that governments couldn't create at will. But cryptocurrencies have their own problems. Their values fluctuate wildly, making them poor stores of value or units of account. The technology is complex and intimidating to many people. Transactions can be slow and expensive. Governments view them with suspicion and are developing regulations that may limit their use. And the fixed supply that prevents debasement also means no flexibility to respond to economic changes. It's the gold standard's rigidity in digital form. Central banks are responding with their own digital currencies. China has already launched a digital yuan. The European Central Bank is developing a digital euro. The Federal Reserve is researching a digital dollar. These central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, would be like having an account directly with the central bank with balances that are central bank liabilities, just like physical currency is. CBDCs raise profound questions about privacy, about the role of commercial banks, about government's ability to monitor and potentially control spending. They also raise the old questions about monetary discipline. If everyone has digital wallets directly with the central bank, and the central bank can credit those wallets instantly with newly created money, does this make helicopter money? Literally dropping money from helicopters? Or the digital equivalent of depositing money directly into everyone's accounts, easier and more tempting? Could future crises be met by direct money transfers to citizens, financed by central bank creation? And if so, what prevents this from becoming a political tool used to win elections or quiet dissent, eroding monetary discipline entirely? These aren't hypothetical worries. During the pandemic, some governments did send money directly to citizens, and many people got a taste of what such transfers feel like. The political pressure to repeat such policies during future crises or even routinely will be intense. A population that has experienced direct government money transfers will ask why such transfers can't happen again, especially during hardship. The trajectory from physical coin to paper money, to digital entries, to potentially direct central bank digital wallets represents increasing abstraction and increasing ease of money creation. Each step has made money more efficient, more convenient, more suited to a complex modern economy. But each step has also made the constraints looser, the discipline harder to maintain, the temptation to create excess money more seductive. We live in a moment of uncertainty about how this latest phase will unfold. Central banks wield unprecedented power to create money, constrained only by mandates and institutional norms that haven't been tested over very long periods in the current form. Governments face debt burdens that create pressure for monetary accommodation. New technologies offer both alternatives to government money and new tools for government monetary control. inflation has returned after decades of stability, raising questions about whether that stability was an anomaly or a sustainable achievement. The optimistic view is that we've learned from history that modern central banks understand the dangers of excessive money creation, that institutional arrangements and professional expertise provide sufficient discipline to prevent repeating past disasters. The system has weathered severe tests, the 2008 crisis, the pandemic, without collapsing into hyperinflation. Perhaps we really have figured out how to manage fiat money responsibly. The pessimistic view is that we're simply in a longer cycle, that the constraints have been loosened so far that inevitable abuse will follow, that the temptation will prove irresistible as it always has. The specifics differ, but the pattern remains: initial discipline, gradual erosion, crisis and debasement. We're just using more sophisticated language and more advanced technology to make the same old mistakes. The truth, as usual, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. We've developed better tools and understanding, but we face the same human temptations and political pressures. Whether we navigate this successfully depends on choices still to be made, on wisdom and restraint that can't be guaranteed, on the vigilance of populations who understand what's at stake when their money is debased. Let these questions rest in your mind as you rest your body. The modern world of central banking and quantitative easing and digital currencies is far removed from Roman denarii or medieval pennies, yet the fundamental dynamics remain recognizably similar. The technology changes, but human nature doesn't. The temptation to create money to solve problems persists across centuries, and the consequences of yielding to that temptation, inflation, wealth transfers, erosion of trust, remain consistent even as the mechanisms become more abstract and complex. We're living through the latest chapter in this ancient story, participating in an experiment in purely fiat money that has no historical precedent in its global scale and technological sophistication. How it ends we cannot yet know, but understanding how previous chapters ended, understanding the patterns that have repeated across millennia, gives us wisdom to interpret the present and perhaps to influence the future. Sleep now with these thoughts drifting through consciousness like ancient coins sinking through dark water, like paper notes scattered by wind, like digital numbers flickering on screens, all of them money, all of them claims on future value. All of them only as good as the promises that back them and the trust that accepts them. We've spent our time together exploring the mechanics of currency debasement, how it's done, who does it, when and why. But we haven't dwelt enough on the most important question: who actually bears the cost when money is debased? Because debasement isn't a victimless crime, even though its victims are often invisible and its perpetrators are rarely punished. Understanding who wins and who loses from monetary debasement reveals something profound about power, about inequality, and about the quiet ways that wealth is transferred in modern societies. Let's start with the most obvious victims, savers. Imagine you've worked for 30 years, living modestly, setting aside money for retirement. You've accumulated, let's say, $200,000 in savings. This money sits in a bank account or in bonds, earning a small amount of interest. You're planning to retire in 5 years and live on this savings plus Social Security or a pension. Now suppose inflation averages 7% annually over those 5 years. Your $200,000 nominally stays the same. You still have $200,000 in your account. But what that money can buy has decreased dramatically. After 5 years of 7% inflation, your purchasing power has fallen by about 30%. The $200,000 now buys what about $140,000 bought when you started. You've lost $60,000 in real terms without spending a penny. Where did that $60,000 go? It didn't disappear. It was transferred to those who benefited from the inflation, primarily borrowers and the government. This is the invisible tax that inflation represents, a transfer of wealth from those who hold money or fixed income assets to those who owe money or can create it. The unfairness is particularly acute for those who have no way to protect themselves. A sophisticated investor might hold assets that appreciate with inflation, stocks, real estate, commodities, but ordinary people saving for retirement in bank accounts or government bonds have no such protection. They're simply robbed, slowly and legally, by the decline in their money's purchasing power. Retirees living on fixed pensions are similarly vulnerable. If you're retired with a pension of $3,000 per month, that might have been comfortable when you retired. But if inflation runs at 5% annually for 10 years, the real value of that pension has fallen by almost 40%. You're trying to live on what's effectively $1,800 per month in original purchasing power. Your standard of living inevitably declines, and there's nothing you can do about it. Social Security in the United States has cost of living adjustments meant to protect retirees from inflation, but these adjustments often lag behind actual price increases and may not fully capture the inflation that retirees actually experience. Retirees spend more on healthcare, which often inflates faster than general prices. They spend less on things like electronics, which often deflate. The official inflation measure may not reflect their reality. Workers on fixed wages also lose from inflation, at least until their wages adjust. If prices rise by 5%, but your wage increases by only 2%, you've taken a 3% real pay cut. Multiply this across an entire workforce and across multiple years, and you see significant transfers of wealth from labour to capital. Workers eventually demand higher wages, but there's often a lag, and during that lag their purchasing power has eroded. Creditors, people who have lent money, lose to debtors when inflation is higher than expected. If you lent someone $100,000 at 5% interest expecting 2% inflation, you were expecting a 3% real return. If actual inflation turns out to be 7%, your real return is negative 2%. The borrower, meanwhile, is repaying the loan in money that's worth less than what was borrowed. The borrower wins, the lender loses. This dynamic is crucial for understanding why governments so often allow or encourage inflation. Governments are the largest borrowers in most economies. When the US government owes $30 trillion in debt, as it did by the early 2020s, even moderate inflation significantly reduces the real value of that debt. 7% inflation for 10 years would cut the real value of that debt roughly in half. It's a way to default on debt without formally defaulting. Who benefits from this invisible default? Taxpayers in a sense, because the real burden of government debt is reduced without raising taxes. But the benefit is distributed unevenly. Wealthy people and corporations often benefit more from government spending than from the stability of currency. They can also protect themselves from inflation better than ordinary people can. The net effect is often regressive, hurting the poor and middle class more than the wealthy. The very process of money creation benefits some people before others, a phenomenon economists call the Cantillon effect after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, who first described it. When a central bank creates money through quantitative easing, that money doesn't appear simultaneously in everyone's wallet. It goes first to banks and financial institutions, then gradually spreads through the economy. Those who receive the new money first can spend it before prices have risen. Those who receive it later find prices have already increased. During the quantitative easing programs after 2008, the new money primarily flowed into financial markets. Stock prices rose dramatically. Real estate prices in major cities soared. People who owned significant financial assets became wealthier. But someone working for an hourly wage saw no immediate benefit from QE and might have seen their rent increase as real estate prices rose. The Cantillon effect in action, those closest to the money creation benefit most, while those furthest away may actually be harmed. This helps explain why wealth inequality increased in many countries during and after the financial crisis, despite, or perhaps because of, the massive monetary expansion meant to help the economy. The expansion helped those who owned assets. It did much less for those who depended on wages. Asset prices inflated while wage growth remained sluggish. The gap between those who owned capital and those who sold labour widened. Consider housing, which is often the largest expense for most families and the largest asset for those who own homes. In the years after 2008, ultra-low interest rates and monetary expansion helped push housing prices higher in many markets. For homeowners, this was wealth creation. Your house is worth more. For renters trying to save for a down payment, it was a treadmill. Housing got more expensive faster than you could save. The monetary policy that enriched existing homeowners made homeownership harder to achieve for the next generation. There's a generational dimension to this. Older generations who accumulated assets during earlier periods benefited from asset price inflation. Younger generations entering the workforce faced higher asset prices relative to their incomes. Houses that cost 3 times annual income for baby boomers might cost 6 or 8 times annual income for millennials. This isn't all due to monetary policy, but monetary policy that inflates asset prices while wage growth lags clearly plays a role. The inflation of 2021 through 2023 hit different groups very differently. For someone who owned a house with a fixed-rate mortgage locked in at 3%, inflation was actually beneficial in some ways. Your mortgage payment stayed constant while your income might have risen with inflation, making the payment easier to afford in real terms, and your house probably appreciated in value. But for someone renting an apartment, inflation was purely harmful. Your rent likely increased, perhaps dramatically. Your wages might have increased too, but often not as much as rent. Groceries became more expensive, gas more expensive, everything more expensive, while your ability to save for your own home fell further behind. Food price inflation particularly hurts lower-income families who spend a larger share of their income on necessities. If you're wealthy, spending an extra $1 per pound on ground beef is annoying but not catastrophic. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, that extra $1 might mean choosing between adequate food and other necessities. The same percentage inflation has vastly different impacts depending on your income level and what you spend money on. Energy price inflation follows a similar pattern. Wealthy people drive expensive cars, but fuel costs are a small percentage of their budget. Poor people might drive old, inefficient cars and spend a significant portion of their income on gas to get to work. When gas prices double, as they did in some places during 2022, it's a genuine hardship for those on tight budgets. These distributive effects of inflation are why it's sometimes called a regressive tax. Like a sales tax, it takes a larger percentage of poor people's resources than rich people's. The poor spend all or most of their income, holding little in cash or bonds. When inflation erodes the value of money, it erodes their entire economic position. The wealthy hold most of their wealth in real assets, stocks, real estate, businesses that often appreciate with inflation. They're largely insulated from inflation's harm and might even benefit from it. There's also a geographical dimension. Inflation rates aren't uniform across a country. Housing inflation in San Francisco is very different from housing inflation in rural Mississippi. Someone in a high-inflation city effectively experiences higher overall inflation than someone in a low-inflation area. National monetary policy can't account for these differences. A policy appropriate for one region might be too loose or too tight for another. International effects add another layer of complexity. When the United States pursues expansionary monetary policy, creating dollars, it affects the whole world because the dollar is the global reserve currency. Countries that peg their currencies to the dollar or hold dollar reserves import American monetary policy whether it's appropriate for their economies or not. American QE can create asset bubbles in emerging markets. American rate hikes can trigger capital flight from those same markets. Poor countries bear consequences of decisions made in Washington or Frankfurt or Tokyo for those economies, not for the global impact. The political economy of inflation is revealing. Inflation harms some groups, savers, retirees, fixed-income workers, who might seem like they should have political power. But these groups are often diffuse and don't mobilise effectively. The benefits of inflation, reduced real debt burdens for government and for borrowers, stimulus to employment and asset prices, often accrue to groups with more political influence, or are indirect enough that people don't clearly connect them to monetary policy. This asymmetry means democracies tend to have an inflationary bias. The pain of inflation is dispersed and often not clearly attributed to policy choices. The political pain of the alternatives, raising taxes, cutting spending. Allowing recession to reduce inflation is concentrated and immediate. Politicians facing this choice often choose inflation, the slow poison over the quick cut. Some countries have tried to protect themselves from this bias through institutional arrangements. Germany's Bundesbank was deliberately made independent and given a singular focus on price stability because of Germany's traumatic history with hyperinflation. The European Central Bank inherited this mandate. The result was that Germany and later the Eurozone tended to have lower inflation than countries with more politically influenced central banks, but also sometimes had less flexibility to respond to recessions. The trade-offs are real. Strict monetary discipline prevents the slow theft of inflation, but might allow unemployment to rise higher than necessary during downturns. More flexible monetary policy can support employment, but risks inflating away savings and distorting the economy. There's no perfect answer, only choices between imperfect alternatives with different winners and losers. Understanding these distributive effects helps us see currency debasement not as a technical economic issue, but as a deeply political and moral one. When a government allows or creates inflation, it's making choices about who benefits and who suffers. These choices often track existing power structures. The wealthy and well-connected can protect themselves and might benefit, while the poor and powerless bear costs they can't escape. Medieval peasants understood this in their own context. When the king debased the coinage, they knew they were being robbed even if they couldn't articulate the mechanism precisely. Their wages stayed the same in number of coins but bought less. Their rents might be fixed in nominal terms, but their ability to pay from their wages declined. They felt the theft even if they couldn't measure it precisely. Modern citizens often don't make this connection as clearly. Inflation seems like a natural phenomenon, like the weather, unfortunate but nobody's fault. The connection between central bank policy, government deficit financing, and the rise in grocery prices isn't obvious. This obscurity is part of what makes inflation politically attractive compared to open taxation. If people clearly understood that monetary expansion was taking their purchasing power to finance government spending, they might object more strenuously. There's something insidious about inflation as a form of theft. Unlike taxation, which is visible and voted on, inflation happens quietly and continuously. Unlike robbery, which takes your property through force, inflation takes your purchasing power through debasement. You still have the same number of dollars in your bank account, but they're worth less, buying less, representing less real wealth. The theft is invisible but real. Some economists argue that moderate stable inflation is actually beneficial, that it greases the wheels of the economy, makes price adjustment easier, reduces the real burden of debt in productive ways. There's some truth to this. An economy with 2% inflation is probably healthier than one with zero inflation. But there's a vast difference between 2% inflation, which is manageable and predictable, and 7% or 10% or higher inflation, which transfers significant wealth and distorts economic decisions. The line between beneficial inflation and harmful inflation is somewhat arbitrary and constantly debated. Central banks mostly settled on 2% as a target, high enough to provide cushion against deflation and some flexibility for monetary policy. Low enough to avoid significant harm to savers and long-term contracts. But this target isn't written in stone, and in recent years some have argued for raising it to give central banks more room to cut real interest rates in recessions. Each change to the target, each redefinition of what inflation rate is acceptable, represents a choice about distribution. Higher inflation targets benefit borrowers, including governments, and might support employment in the short run. Lower inflation targets benefit savers and promote long-term economic stability. Changing the target changes who wins and who loses. As you rest now, as these thoughts of winners and losers, of visible and invisible theft, of power and vulnerability drift through your consciousness, consider how personal these abstract economic concepts are. Every time you buy groceries, you're experiencing the consequences of monetary decisions made by people you'll never meet. Every time you check your savings account balance, the real value of those numbers is being determined by forces far beyond your control. You're embedded in this monetary system, affected by its fluctuations, vulnerable to its abuses. The people who decide monetary policy, central bankers, government officials, economists, are generally intelligent and well-meaning. They face genuinely difficult trade-offs. But they're also human, subject to pressures and blind spots, sometimes captured by the interests of those they're supposed to regulate, sometimes simply wrong about how the economy works or what policies will produce what results. And the people who bear the consequences of these decisions, retirees watching their savings erode, workers watching their wages buy less, young people unable to afford housing that previous generations could, are largely powerless. They can vote, but monetary policy is typically insulated from direct democratic control, deliberately so. They can complain, but inflation is complex enough that their complaints might be dismissed or attributed to other causes. Mostly they just endure, adjusting their lives to accommodate the loss of purchasing power, the invisible tax they never voted for and can't escape. This is the human face of currency debasement. Not just numbers and percentages and economic theory, but real people experiencing real losses. The Roman worker who found his denarii bought less bread. The German widow whose savings became worthless in 1923. The American retiree in 2022 watching grocery bills double while her pension stayed constant. Across centuries and continents, the victims of monetary debasement share this experience of betrayal, of promises broken, of value stolen not through force but through the manipulation of money itself. Let these stories, these faces, these quiet losses settle into your mind as you settle into rest. Because this isn't just history. It's happening now, will happen tomorrow, will continue happening as long as someone has the power to create money and the incentive to create too much of it. The technology changes, the institutions evolve, but the fundamental dynamic persists. Those who control money can enrich themselves and their allies by impoverishing those who merely use money, and the victims often don't even realize they're being robbed until years later when they notice their savings buy less than they remember. Their wages stretch less far than they used to. Their plans for the future cost more than they'd anticipated. Sleep now with the knowledge that this ancient crime continues in modern dress, that we are all participants in a system where our wealth can be quietly eroded for others' benefit, and that understanding this reality is the first step toward protecting ourselves and demanding better from those who wield monetary power over our lives. We've traced the story of currency debasement across 26 centuries. From ancient Lydia to the present moment, watching the same pattern repeat in different forms with different technologies, but with remarkably consistent dynamics. Now we face perhaps the most important question: can we ever escape this cycle? Is there a monetary system that can resist the eternal temptation to debase, that can maintain honest value across generations, that can serve the economy's needs without falling prey to the political pressures and human weaknesses that have corrupted every system eventually? This question has occupied some of the most brilliant minds of recent decades, and it's produced fascinating and divergent answers. Let's explore them thoughtfully, because each proposed solution reveals something important about the nature of money and the challenge of maintaining its integrity. The most prominent recent attempt to escape debasement is Bitcoin, created in 2009 by someone using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. Bitcoin's origin story is revealing. It emerged directly from the 2008 financial crisis, from the bank bailouts and the quantitative easing, from a moment when trust in traditional financial institutions and central banks was at a low point. The very first Bitcoin block, mined on January 3, 2009, contained a message. The Times March 3, 2009 Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. This wasn't just a timestamp, it was a statement of purpose. Bitcoin's fundamental innovation is creating digital scarcity. Before Bitcoin, anything digital could be copied infinitely at no cost. An email, a photo, a document. These can be duplicated endlessly. But money requires scarcity to have value. Bitcoin solved this through a clever combination of cryptography and distributed consensus. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins, and this limit is enforced not by any institution, but by the mathematical protocol that governs the system. This is meant to make Bitcoin immune to debasement. No government can decide to create more Bitcoins. No central bank can engage in quantitative easing with Bitcoin. The supply is fixed, predictable, and utterly inflexible. For Bitcoin advocates, this is the solution to millennia of monetary debasement. Create money that can't be debased, and you solve the problem at its root. The appeal of this idea is obvious and profound. Imagine knowing with certainty that the money you save today will represent the same share of the total money supply 20 years from now. No government can inflate it away. No central bank can steal your purchasing power through expansion. The Bitcoin you hold is 1/21 millionth of the total supply today, and will remain 1/21 millionth forever. If you trust mathematics and computer code more than you trust governments and central bankers, Bitcoin seems like a revelation. But Bitcoin's rigidity is also its fundamental weakness. The gold standard had a relatively fixed supply of money, and we saw how that created problems: deflation, inability to respond to crises, transfers of wealth from debtors to creditors. Bitcoin is even more rigid than gold. At least with gold, new discoveries could expand the supply somewhat. Bitcoin's supply is truly fixed, expanding on a predetermined schedule until reaching the 21 million limit around the year 2140. In an economy using Bitcoin as money, any economic growth would have to be accommodated by rising Bitcoin prices, deflation in traditional terms. If the economy grows by 3% per year but the money supply can't grow, then prices measured in Bitcoin must fall by roughly 3% per year. This is mathematically necessary. But persistent deflation creates the problems we've discussed, encouraging hoarding rather than spending, making debts harder to repay, creating economic distortions. Bitcoin advocates argue these concerns are overblown, that people will spend money when they need things regardless of whether money is appreciating, that as deflationary currency simply requires adjusting expectations and habits. Perhaps they're right. But centuries of economic experience suggest deflation is harmful, and it's notable that no major economy has successfully operated with persistent deflation for extended periods. There are also practical problems with Bitcoin as money. Its value is extraordinarily volatile, rising from pennies to tens of thousands of dollars, falling by 50% or more during crashes. Impossible to predict. This volatility makes it unsuitable as a unit of account or medium of exchange. You can't price goods in Bitcoin when Bitcoin's value changes dramatically day to day. You can't receive a salary in Bitcoin when that salary might buy twice as much or half as much the next week. Bitcoin supporters say this volatility will decrease as Bitcoin matures and becomes more widely held. Perhaps, but the built-in deflation means there's always an incentive to hoard Bitcoin rather than spend it, which limits its circulation and probably sustains volatility. And the psychological difficulty of spending something that might be worth much more tomorrow is real. If you bought coffee with Bitcoin that's now worth thousands of dollars, you effectively paid thousands of dollars for that coffee. This makes Bitcoin function more like a speculative asset than like money. The transaction costs and speed are also problematic. Bitcoin transactions can be slow and expensive. especially during periods of high demand. This makes it impractical for everyday purchases. Various technical solutions have been proposed, second-layer systems like the Lightning Network that handle small transactions off the main blockchain. But these add complexity and reintroduce some of the trust issues Bitcoin was meant to solve. Governments view Bitcoin with deep suspicion, seeing it as facilitating tax evasion, money laundering, and criminal activity. The anonymity Bitcoin provides, not perfect but significant, is valuable for privacy but also enables illegal uses. Governments have considerable power to restrict Bitcoin adoption through regulation, taxation, and enforcement. China banned Bitcoin mining and trading. Other countries have implemented various restrictions. The more successful Bitcoin becomes as an alternative to government currency, the more likely governments are to suppress it. All of this suggests Bitcoin might not be the solution to currency debasement that its advocates hope. It's more likely to remain a niche asset, held by some people as a hedge against inflation or government overreach, but not replacing government currencies as the primary medium of exchange. The dream of escaping government money entirely through cryptocurrency appears difficult to realize in practice. But Bitcoin has inspired thousands of other cryptocurrencies, each with different characteristics. Some, like Ethereum, are programmable, allowing complex applications. Others experiment with different consensus mechanisms or governance structures. The cryptocurrency ecosystem is vibrant and innovative, but it's also chaotic, prone to scams and speculation, and hasn't yet produced a clearly superior alternative to traditional money. Stablecoins, cryptocurrencies designed to maintain stable value by being backed by traditional currencies or other assets, are a bridge between crypto and traditional finance. In theory, a stablecoin gives you the technological benefits of cryptocurrency with the stability of traditional money. In practice, stablecoins have had mixed results. Some have maintained their peg successfully, others have failed spectacularly. The Terra/Luna collapse in 2022 wiped out tens of billions of dollars in value when its algorithmic stablecoin lost its peg and entered a death spiral. The episode demonstrated that stability is hard to achieve and maintain even with clever design. Meanwhile, governments are developing their own digital currencies. China's digital yuan is already in limited use. The European Central Bank is working on a digital euro. The Federal Reserve is researching a digital dollar. These central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are fundamentally different from cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. They're centralized, controlled by the central bank, and represent the existing currency in digital form rather than a new currency. CBDCs offer potential advantages: more efficient payments, better financial inclusion, the ability to implement negative interest rates or send money directly to citizens. But they also raise concerns about privacy and control. If all money is digital and runs through central bank accounts, the government could potentially monitor every transaction, block certain types of spending, or even program money to expire or only work for certain purposes. The level of control this enables is unprecedented and troubling to many observers. The irony is striking. Bitcoin was created to escape government control of money, to create a monetary system that governments couldn't manipulate. The response from governments is to create their own digital currencies that would give them even more control than they have over physical cash. Whether CBDCs will be designed to protect privacy and limit government power, or to enhance surveillance and control, is an open question. And the answer will vary by country. Some look to the past for solutions rather than to technological innovation. There are periodic calls to return to the gold standard, to re-establish the link between currency and physical commodity. The appeal is the discipline gold imposes. You can't debase a gold-backed currency without eventually running out of gold. The historical problems with the gold standard, deflation, rigidity, vulnerability to gold discoveries or depletion, are acknowledged but argued to be preferable to the unlimited debasement possible with fiat currency. A return to gold seems unlikely for practical and political reasons. The existing gold supply is tiny relative to the size of the global economy. Trying to back all current currency with gold at any reasonable price would create massive deflation. Alternatively, the gold price would have to rise enormously, some estimates suggest tens of thousands of dollars per ounce, to make the math work. Either outcome would be massively disruptive. More fundamentally, the gold standard was abandoned because it couldn't provide the flexibility modern economies need. The Great Depression was worsened by countries' adherence to gold, and recovery came when they abandoned it. World War II could not have been financed on the gold standard. The post-war boom occurred under Bretton Woods and then fiat money, not under gold. Whatever gold's virtues, the likelihood of voluntarily returning to its constraints seems very small. Some economists advocate rules-based monetary policy as a middle path. Rather than giving central banks complete discretion, embed them in rules. Increase the money supply by X% per year, or keep inflation at Y%. With limited ability to deviate, this would provide more discipline than pure discretion while allowing more flexibility than gold or Bitcoin. Milton Friedman famously advocated for a steady, predictable growth in money supply. John Taylor proposed a rule for setting interest rates based on inflation and economic output. Rules have appeal. They're transparent, predictable, and limit political interference. But they're also rigid and might not be appropriate during unusual circumstances. The financial crisis required actions that no pre-existing rule would have permitted. Pandemic response required flexibility that rules would constrain. There's a reason central banks resist being bound by strict rules. They want flexibility to respond to unforeseen situations, and rules can be changed if they become inconvenient. A government facing severe crisis would likely modify or abandon rules that prevented necessary action. So rules provide discipline only as long as the political will to maintain them exists, which brings us back to the fundamental problem. Monetary integrity depends ultimately on human wisdom and restraint, not on mechanisms. Constitutional protections for money have been tried in various forms. The US Constitution originally gave Congress the power to coin money but said nothing about paper money, an omission that many scholars believe was intentional. Various countries have constitutional provisions limiting government debt or requiring balanced budgets. The European Union's Stability and Growth Pact attempted to limit member states' deficits and debt levels. These constitutional protections have had mixed success. They're regularly evaded, reinterpreted, or suspended during crises. The EU's fiscal rules have been violated repeatedly, including by major countries like France and Germany. When push comes to shove, constitutional provisions are words on paper, enforceable only if institutions and populations insist on enforcement. Perhaps the most honest answer to whether we can escape currency debasement is, probably not completely, but we can do better or worse. The quality of money depends on the quality of institutions, the wisdom of policymakers, the vigilance of populations, and some amount of luck. Good institutions, independent central banks with clear mandates, transparency, accountability, help. Educated populations who understand monetary policy and demand discipline help. Political cultures that value long-term stability over short-term expediency help. But none of these guarantee success. Weimar Germany had intelligent, educated people and developed institutions, yet it descended into hyperinflation. Venezuela in the 2010s was not a medieval backwater, but a modern state with trained economists, yet it experienced catastrophic currency collapse. The United States in the 1970s had the Federal Reserve and sophisticated understanding of economics, yet it produced double-digit inflation. Conversely, some countries have managed their currencies responsibly for extended periods. Switzerland has maintained monetary discipline and low inflation for decades. Singapore managed its currency effectively during its rapid development. These successes show responsible management is possible, but they don't guarantee it will continue. Vigilance must be constant because the temptation is eternal. there's a case to be made for monetary pluralism, allowing multiple forms of money to coexist and compete. Let governments issue fiat currency. Let banks issue their own notes or digital currencies backed by assets. Let cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin exist as alternatives. Let people use gold or silver if they prefer. Competition might provide discipline. If government money is being debased, people can flee to alternatives, forcing government to maintain value to keep their currency relevant. This was effectively how things worked in the 19th century in the United States, with multiple banks issuing notes. It was chaotic and sometimes problematic, but it also limited any single institution's ability to debase the currency disastrously. The monopolization of money issuance by central banks in the 20th century provided uniformity and efficiency, but also concentrated enormous power with no competitive check. Technology might enable a return to monetary pluralism. Digital currencies, stable coins, cryptocurrencies, these can coexist with government money more easily than physical alternatives could. You might receive salary in dollars, save in Bitcoin, spend using a stable coin, and hold gold as insurance. This portfolio approach to money might protect against any single currency's debasement, but governments resist this, wanting monopoly control over the medium of exchange within their territory. Legal tender laws, capital controls, taxation of alternative currencies, these tools enforce the government money monopoly. How this tension between technological possibility and government power resolves will shape monetary systems in coming decades. The fundamental challenge is that money is both an economic tool and a political power. Economically, we want money that's stable, trustworthy, and sufficient to facilitate commerce. Politically, those who control money have immense power to finance spending, to redistribute wealth, to reward allies and punish enemies. These economic and political functions are in tension. What's best economically, stable, limited money supply, constrains political power. What's tempting politically, expandable money supply to finance priorities, undermines economic stability. This tension can't be eliminated, only managed. Every monetary system is a compromise between these competing demands, and the balance shifts over time with political and economic conditions. The question isn't whether we can create a perfect monetary system immune to debasement. The question is how much debasement we tolerate in exchange for what benefits, and who makes that choice. Democracy complicates this. In principle, people should be able to choose their monetary system through democratic processes. In practice, monetary policy is highly technical, its effects are delayed and diffuse, and most people don't understand it well enough to make informed choices. Delegating monetary policy to expert central bankers insulates it from short-term political pressures, but also removes it from democratic accountability. There's no easy answer to this dilemma. Perhaps the most we can hope for is transparency and contestation. If monetary policy is made openly, with clear explanations and public debate, if alternative views can be expressed and considered, if there's genuine accountability for failure, then the system might stumble toward reasonable outcomes even if perfection is impossible. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and public scrutiny might provide the discipline that gold or algorithms or rules cannot. The story of currency debasement is ultimately a story about trust and power. We trust money to store value, and that trust gives enormous power to whoever controls money's supply and quality. Throughout history, that power has been abused with depressing regularity. The abuses take different forms: clipping coins, printing assignats, quantitative easing, but the pattern is consistent. Those with power over money use it to benefit themselves and their priorities, and ordinary people bear the costs. Can we break this pattern? History suggests it's very difficult. Human nature doesn't change. Political pressures recur. New technologies create new temptations even as they eliminate old ones. But history also shows that some societies manage money more responsibly than others, that institutions matter, that vigilance and understanding can check power's worst excesses. We live in a moment of monetary uncertainty. The old order, Bretton Woods, stable exchange rates, clear rules, is long gone. The era that followed, floating rates, independent central banks targeting low inflation, seemed stable but proved vulnerable to crisis. The response to crisis, massive money creation, near zero interest rates, blurred lines between monetary and fiscal policy, has brought us to unfamiliar territory with uncertain consequences. Where we go from here depends on choices still to be made. Will central banks maintain discipline and bring inflation back to low levels, or will political pressure lead to accommodation of higher inflation? Will new technologies like cryptocurrency provide genuine alternatives to government money, or will they remain niche assets? Will governments use digital currencies to enhance control, or will privacy and freedom concerns create limits? Will the lessons of history inform current decisions, or will each generation relearn painful truths through fresh experience? These questions don't have predetermined answers. The future is contingent, dependent on human choices, wisdom, folly, and chance. Understanding the long history of currency debasement doesn't let us predict the future, but it gives context and perspective. It shows the patterns that have repeated, the mistakes made again and again, the rare successes and common failures. It reminds us that the challenge of honest money is ancient and ongoing, that it's been solved temporarily but never permanently, that vigilance can never end because temptation never does. As you drift now between waking and sleeping, between engagement with these questions and release into rest, hold in your mind the thread we've traced from ancient Lydia, through medieval Europe, through Weimar Germany, to our own present moment. The technology has transformed beyond recognition. The understanding has deepened immeasurably. But the fundamental dynamic persists. Money derives value from trust, and those who control money are forever tempted to betray that trust for immediate gain. Whether we can finally, durably, structure monetary systems to resist this temptation remains an open question. History provides grounds for both pessimism and hope. The answer will be written not by inevitable forces, but by choices made by fallible humans in positions of power, and by the success or failure of populations to hold them accountable. Sleep now with these ancient questions that remain urgently contemporary, these patterns that repeat across centuries, these challenges that each generation inherits and must address anew in its own context, with its own tools, but always facing the same eternal temptations and the same difficult choices between expedience and integrity. And so we've travelled together through 26 centuries of human struggle with money, with trust, with the eternal tension between what we promise and what we deliver. We've watched kings clip coins in candlelit chambers, seen paper money burn worthless in German streets, traced the invisible theft of inflation as it flows through our own time. The story continues even now, even as you rest, as central banks make decisions and currencies fluctuate, and the ancient dance between power and integrity plays out in modern dress. You're part of this story, you know. Every time you work for money, save it, spend it, trust that it will hold value until tomorrow. You're participating in this delicate human agreement that spans millennia. Your wages, your savings, your plans for the future, all rest on the same foundation of trust that Roman merchants relied on, that medieval peasants hoped for, that has been betrayed and restored and betrayed again across all the centuries we've explored together. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight, let it all drift away. Let the coins scatter into darkness. Let the paper notes flutter down like autumn leaves. Let the digital numbers fade from screens into peaceful emptiness. You've learned what you needed to learn. You've understood what connects past to present. Now it's time to rest. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. Feel your breathing slow, deep and steady like the tides. The story of money will continue without you for these few hours of sleep. The world will turn, and you, having glimpsed the long pattern of human nature and money across the ages, can rest in the knowledge that wisdom comes from understanding. that awareness protects better than ignorance. That you're now part of that small number of people who see clearly the game being played and the stakes involved. Sleep well. Dream of honest coins and trustworthy promises. Dream of a world where value is preserved and trust is honoured. Or dream of nothing at all. Just let go. Let it all go. Everything we've discussed, every pattern traced, every lesson learned, it will all be there when you wake, settled more deeply into understanding for having drifted through your sleeping mind. For now there's only darkness, only breath, only the gentle descent into rest. Good night.